It is a cold morning in late December, and a monk is walking across a frozen courtyard with his hands tucked into his sleeves. The stones under his sandals are slick with frost, and every breath he takes hangs in the air for a moment before disappearing. He is not thinking about kings or armies. He is thinking about the fire in the kitchen, and whether the bread will rise properly in this cold, and whether the lake outside the monastery walls has frozen solid enough yet to walk across. The monastery sits on a small island, surrounded on all sides by dark, still water, and beyond that water, a forest so thick and so quiet that sound seems to disappear into it rather than travel through it. Somewhere inside the monastery walls, behind a low door that nobody bothers to lock because there is nothing inside worth stealing, lies a plain stone slab. No name is carved into it. No date. Just a flat gray stone, cold to the touch, resting a few feet from the altar. The monk has walked past that stone 1,000 times. He has swept snow from around it in winter and pulled weeds from its edges in summer. He has never once wondered, out loud at least, who might be lying beneath it. But 4.5 centuries later, archaeologists will kneel exactly where this monk is standing, and they will ask a question that no one in this quiet monastery ever thought to ask while the wax was still dripping from the candles. They will dig beneath that unmarked slab, and they will find nothing but animal bones and scraps of pottery. And somewhere else, in a small church many miles away, another set of bones will surface that nobody expected, wrapped in fragments of cloth far too fine for an ordinary grave. The man this story is about disappeared from his own burial place sometime between the year he died and the year people started asking where he had gone. And in that gap, in that empty stone slab with no name, an entire legend was born. A legend so large that it would eventually swallow the real man whole, until most of the world forgot he had ever been anything other than a story told to frighten children at bedtime. This is not a story about a monster. It is the story of a prince who ruled a small, exhausted country squeezed between two empires that wanted to eat it alive. A man who used fear the way a blacksmith uses fire, deliberately, precisely, and for reasons that made complete sense to the people of his own time, even when they horrify us now. His name was Vlad. History would eventually give him a nickname that came from his father, and centuries later, an Irish novelist who had probably never set foot in his country would borrow that nickname for a vampire who has since eaten every trace of the real man out of popular memory. Tonight, we are going to walk backward through the smoke and find him again. We begin, as his story does, not in a castle, but in a mountain kingdom wedged between two hungry empires, in a century when survival itself was the rarest form of victory. Hello and welcome. I'm glad you're here tonight, wherever here happens to be for you. If you're new to this channel, this is the place where history gets told slowly, the way it might have been told around a fire centuries ago, without rushing, without noise, and without the need to shout at you to keep your attention. If that sounds like your kind of evening, consider staying a while and subscribing, so more of these quiet, immersive stories find their way to you. Before we go further, I'd love to know a little about you. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are right now? Maybe it's already dark outside your window. Maybe you're getting ready for bed. Maybe you're driving home from a long shift and just need something calm to listen to. Whatever brought you here, settle in. Let your shoulders drop a little. We have a long night of history ahead of us, and there is no need to hurry through any of it. Tonight's story takes us to a part of Europe that most people can point to on a map only vaguely, if at all. A land of forested mountains, sudden rivers, and a climate that swings from brutal winters to burning summers. a land that produced one of history's most misunderstood rulers, a man whose real life was, in many ways, stranger and sadder than the myth that eventually replaced him. So let's go inside that world. Let's begin at the beginning in a kingdom called Wallachia, at a moment when Europe itself was holding its breath. A land between two jaws. To understand the man, you first have to understand the land, because in the 15th century, geography was not just background scenery. Geography was destiny. Wallachia, the country Vlad would one day rule, sat in the lower half of what is now Romania, a strip of plains and rolling hills bordered on the north by the Carpathian Mountains and on the south by the wide, slow-moving Danube River. On a map, it looks almost peaceful, tucked between forests and water. In reality, it sat directly between two of the most powerful forces on the continent, and neither of them had any intention of leaving it alone. To the north and west lay the Kingdom of Hungary, a Catholic power that saw itself as the last line of Christian defense in Europe. To the south lay the Ottoman Empire, a rising Muslim power that had already swallowed most of the Balkans and was hungry for more. Wallachia sat exactly in the middle, like a narrow strip of land caught between the closing jaws of two much larger animals. Its rulers did not get to choose whether to be involved in this struggle. They only got to choose, again and again, which jaw to lean toward on any given year, and how to survive being crushed a little by whichever one they had just angered. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains almost everything that happens later in this story. Vlad did not grow up in a stable, secure court where he could think about legacy or culture or comfort. He grew up in a country where the neighboring superpower could arrive with an army on relatively short notice, where alliances shifted year to year, and where a ruler's own nobles, called boyars, were just as likely to conspire against him as any foreign king. Wallachia had no natural mountain wall to hide behind, unlike some of its neighbors. Its plains were good for growing wheat and grazing cattle, which made the land valuable, and valuable land in that century was land that other people wanted to take. If you had walked through a Wallachian village in the early 1400s, you would have found a world running almost entirely on wood, wool, and water. Houses were built from timber and packed earth, roofs thatched with reeds cut from the riverbanks. Villages clustered along rivers not for the view, but because rivers were the roads of the medieval world, carrying grain to market and salt down from the mountain mines that were one of the region's great sources of wealth. Salt, in fact, was almost as valuable as gold in this part of Europe, and Wallachia's salt mines quietly funded a surprising amount of its political survival. Life moved with the seasons in a way that is almost impossible for us to fully imagine now. Spring meant plowing and the terror of a late frost. Summer meant the long, exhausting labor of the harvest, when entire villages worked from the moment the sky lightened until it was too dark to see. Autumn meant salting meat, drying fruit, and repairing whatever the winter before had damaged. And winter itself was less a season than a test, one that killed the old, the sick, and the unlucky with a quiet efficiency that nobody thought to write down because it happened every single year. Religion sat at the center of daily life in a way that modern viewers sometimes underestimate. Wallachia was Orthodox Christian, following the Byzantine tradition rather than the Catholic one practiced in Hungary and most of Western Europe. This mattered enormously. It meant Wallachians looked toward Constantinople, not Rome, for their spiritual leadership, even as Constantinople itself was living on borrowed time, slowly being surrounded by Ottoman territory on every side. Monasteries were not quiet retreats from the world. They were centers of literacy, medicine, diplomacy, and record-keeping, often the only places in the entire country where anyone could read or write with real skill. And it was into this pressured, fragile, endlessly contested land that a boy was born who would grow up to rule it twice, lose it twice, and eventually die defending it a third time. But before we can talk about the man, we need to talk about his father, because very few sons in history have inherited a more complicated and, frankly, more dangerous name. The dragon's son Vlad's father was a man named Vlad II, and in 1431, roughly a decade before the future prince was even born, this Vlad II traveled to the German city of Nuremberg to be formally inducted into a chivalric order created by the Holy Roman Emperor. This organization was called the Order of the Dragon, and its purpose was simple in theory and nearly impossible in practice: to defend Christian Europe against the advancing Ottoman Turks. Membership in the Order of the Dragon came with a badge, quite literally, a dragon curled into a circle, its tail wrapped around its own neck with a small red cross on its back. Knights wore this symbol on their clothing and their seals. And in the Romanian language of the time, the word for dragon was Dracul. So Vlad II became known, informally at first and then permanently, as Vlad Dracula. Vlad, son of the dragon. Here is where a small linguistic detail becomes historically important. The word Dracul in Romanian carried a double meaning even then, because the same root word could also mean devil. Whether Vlad II's contemporaries thought of him as the dragon or the devil likely depended on which side of him they had experienced, since medieval nicknames were rarely neutral. And when his son was born, that son would eventually be given the name Dracula, meaning, quite literally, son of Dracul, son of the dragon, or if you preferred to read it the other way, son of the devil. Most historians place the birth of this son sometime in late 1431 in the Transylvanian town of Siasora, which at the time was not even part of Wallachia at all, but a Saxon merchant town under Hungarian control. This detail matters because it tells us something about the precarious position Vlad II was in even before his own son was born. He was a claimant to the Wallachian throne, living in exile, waiting, watching, positioning himself for a chance to actually rule the country whose crown he technically had a right to. If you visit Siasora today, you can still walk through cobblestone streets lined with pastel-colored merchant houses, their upper floors leaning slightly out over the road the way medieval buildings often did to maximize space without taking more ground floor footprint. A clock tower still stands watch over the town square, its mechanical figures rotating with the days of the week, a piece of engineering that would have seemed almost magical to the people living there in the 1430s. Whether the specific house often pointed to as Vlad's birthplace is truly accurate is something historians debate, since building ownership records from this period are frustratingly incomplete. What is certain is that the town itself, with its German-speaking merchants, Hungarian administrators, and Romanian peasants working the surrounding farmland, gives us a small window into just how many different worlds intersected in this one corner of Europe. Young Vlad was one of several sons. He had an older half-brother named Mircea and a younger brother named Radu, who would later become known, somewhat unfairly, as Radu the Handsome, largely because of how differently his life would turn out. All three boys were born into a family whose survival depended entirely on the shifting winds of two empires, and none of them had any say in the political games that would soon consume their childhoods entirely. By 1436, Vlad II had finally succeeded in claiming the Wallachian throne, moving his young family from exile into the princely court itself. For a few years, it must have felt, at least on the surface, like the family's fortunes had turned. But peace in Wallachia was never permanent, and it was about to become very personal for a boy who was still only a child. Hostage at the Sultan's court in 1442, when Vlad was around 11 years old, his father made a decision that would shape the rest of his son's life. And it is a decision that only makes sense once you understand just how impossible Vlad II's political position had become. Squeezed between Hungarian pressure from the north and Ottoman pressure from the south, Vlad II agreed to send two of his sons, young Vlad and his younger brother Radu, to live at the court of the Ottoman Sultan, Murad II, as a guarantee of his own loyalty. This practice, handing over royal children as living insurance policies, was common across this part of Europe and the Ottoman world. It was not seen as abandonment in the way it might strike us today. It was simply how weaker states managed relationships with stronger ones. The children were not thrown into a dungeon. They were educated, housed, and in many ways given an extraordinary, if involuntary, exposure to one of the most sophisticated empires on earth. But none of that changes the basic emotional truth sitting underneath the politics. Two young boys were sent away from their family to live among the very people their own country feared most, with no real certainty of when, or if, they would return home. We know relatively little about the day-to-day emotional experience of this period, since neither boy left behind a diary or a letter describing how it felt, but we can piece together the world they were living in. The Ottoman court at this time was a place of remarkable learning. Vlad and Radu would have studied the Turkish language, along with Arabic and Persian to some degree, since these were the languages of scholarship, poetry, and religious study across the Islamic world. They would have been trained in horsemanship, archery, and swordsmanship, skills expected of any young man being raised in a court that prized military excellence above almost everything else. Historians differ on how harshly the brothers were treated. Some later accounts, written by Vlad's political enemies decades afterward, claim he was beaten and imprisoned as a difficult, defiant child. Other historians point out that these accounts appeared specifically to explain, and perhaps excuse, Vlad's later brutality, framing it as something the Ottomans had planted in him rather than something that emerged from his own character and circumstances. What we can say with more confidence is that the two brothers reacted to their captivity in strikingly different ways, and this difference would eventually put them on opposite sides of history. Radu, the younger of the two, seems to have adapted comfortably to Ottoman court life. He formed close relationships within the Sultan's household, and some later chroniclers even suggested a romantic relationship between Radu and the future Sultan Mehmed II, though this claim is impossible to verify and was sometimes used by Radu's later enemies to discredit him. Whatever the precise nature of these relationships, Radu grew comfortable enough within Ottoman society that he would later rule Wallachia himself, for a time, as a loyal Ottoman client, a choice that put him in direct and lasting opposition to his own brother. Vlad, by contrast, seems to have absorbed the experience very differently. He learned the language and the customs, and he clearly studied the Ottoman military and administrative systems closely enough to later borrow heavily from them once he held power himself. But those who study his later reign point to something else entirely, a deep, cold resentment that never fully left him. Whatever warmth or comfort Radu found in Ottoman captivity, Vlad appears to have experienced the same years as a prolonged humiliation, a reminder that his family and his country existed only at the pleasure of a much larger power. There is a quiet detail historians sometimes highlight here, one that says more about Vlad's psychology than almost any battle he would later fight. Years afterward, as ruler of Wallachia, Vlad would become famous, or infamous, for his obsession with honesty, order, and brutal consistency in punishment. Some historians suggest this obsession traces directly back to his years as a hostage, when his own safety depended entirely on his ability to read the moods, promises, and betrayals of powerful men who owed him nothing. A child who learns early that survival depends on absolute vigilance rarely grows into an adult who forgives uncertainty easily. While Vlad and Radu lived under Ottoman supervision, events back home were moving quickly and not in their family's favor. Their father was walking an impossibly thin line between Hungarian and Ottoman demands, and thin lines in this era had a tendency to snap without warning. The murder of a father in 1447, while Vlad was still in his mid-teens and still living under Ottoman supervision, everything changed at once, and it changed with a violence that would echo through the rest of his life. Wallachian politics in this period revolved around a powerful noble faction and a Hungarian military leader named John Hunyadi, one of the most formidable Christian commanders fighting against Ottoman expansion in the Balkans. Hunyadi had grown deeply suspicious of Vlad II's loyalties, viewing him as too accommodating toward the Ottomans, largely because Vlad II had, quite reasonably from his own perspective, tried to avoid provoking the empire that was currently holding two of his sons hostage. This is one of the darker ironies buried in this story. The very act meant to protect his sons, sending them to the Ottoman court as a peace guarantee, made their father look like an Ottoman collaborator to the Hungarians, and that suspicion would ultimately cost him his life. In late 1447, Hunyadi's forces, working alongside rebellious Wallachian boyars, moved against Vlad II. He was captured near the town of Baltani and executed, reportedly by beheading, in a swamp not far from the Wallachian capital. His eldest son, Mircea, Vlad's older half-brother, was captured separately by boyars in the town of Targoviste. According to several chronicles, Mircea was blinded with a hot iron and then buried alive, a punishment horrifying even by the standards of a century that was no stranger to horrifying punishments. We should pause here on a point of historical honesty. The exact details of Mircea's death come primarily from later sources, and while blinding and live burial were documented forms of political execution in this region during this era, historians cannot verify every specific detail with certainty. What is far better documented is the basic fact itself. Within a very short span of time, Vlad lost his father and his older brother to political violence carried out by the very factions, Hungarian and boyar alike, that were supposed to represent stability in his homeland. Try, for a moment, to sit inside that reality rather than simply reading past it. Vlad was somewhere between 15 and 16 years old. He was living as a hostage in the court of the empire his family had spent years trying to appease, and news reached him that his father had been murdered and his brother tortured to death, not by foreign invaders in some distant war, but by his own country's nobility working alongside a Hungarian commander. The people who killed his family were not strangers from across a border. They were the very boyar class Vlad would later be forced to rule, cooperate with, and eventually, when he took the throne himself, terrorize into submission. It is worth noting how differently a modern audience and a 15th-century audience would receive this event. Today, we might frame this purely as personal tragedy, a boy losing his family. In the world Vlad actually lived in, this was also, immediately and unavoidably, a political catastrophe. The Wallachian throne was now vacant, contested, and up for grabs among rival boyar factions and Hungarian-backed candidates, all while the rightful heir was sitting, essentially powerless, in the household of the very empire everyone in Wallachia was afraid of. For the Ottomans, this sudden vacancy was not a tragedy at all. It was an opportunity. And in one of history's stranger twists, the empire that had held Vlad hostage for years was about to become the very power that placed him on his father's throne for the first time, not out of kindness, but out of cold political calculation. A brief first throne in 1448, with Wallachia's throne effectively empty and John Hunyadi occupied elsewhere fighting a major campaign against the Ottomans, the empire decided to install its own candidate in Wallachia to secure its northern flank. That candidate was Vlad himself, now roughly 17 years old, placed on his father's throne with Ottoman military backing. This first reign was remarkably short, lasting only a matter of months. Hunyadi, fresh off his campaign, quickly moved to reverse the Ottoman-backed installation, and Vlad was forced to flee Wallachia almost as soon as he had arrived. He had ruled a throne he had waited his entire short life to claim for perhaps 2 months before losing it entirely. What is genuinely interesting about this brief first reign is not the reign itself, since almost no significant governing decisions from this period survive in the historical record, but rather what it reveals about Vlad's political position going forward. He now understood something that would define the rest of his career. In Wallachia, the throne was never secure simply because you were the rightful heir. It had to be seized, defended, and constantly reinforced against rival claimants who had just as much royal blood and just as much ambition. Legitimacy on paper meant very little without the military and political power to back it up. Forced into exile once again, this time as a young man in his late teens rather than a child, Vlad spent the following years moving between courts, searching for allies who might help him reclaim what he considered rightfully his. This period of his life is genuinely difficult to trace with precision, since he does not appear consistently in the surviving records of any single court. Historians generally believe he spent time in Moldavia, a neighboring principality ruled by relatives, and later in Hungarian territory, specifically in Transylvania, working to build relationships with the very political network responsible for his father's death. This last detail deserves a moment of reflection, because it tells you something important about the nature of medieval politics and about Vlad's own personality. He did not spend these years plotting bloody revenge against Hunyadi, at least not as far as the historical record shows. Instead, remarkably, he eventually formed a working political relationship with the Hungarian commander whose actions had directly led to his father's execution. This was not forgiveness in any personal sense. It was survival calculus. Hunyadi controlled resources, military strength, and political influence that Vlad desperately needed if he ever hoped to reclaim Wallachia permanently, and personal grievance, however justified, was a luxury a landless claimant could not afford to indulge. By the mid-1450s, the political winds in the region had shifted dramatically. In 1453, Constantinople itself fell to the Ottomans under the young Sultan Mehmed II, an event that sent shockwaves through every Christian court in Europe. The Eastern Roman Empire, which had stood for over 1,000 years, simply ceased to exist. For a country like Wallachia, sitting directly in the path of Ottoman expansion, this event was not distant news. It was a preview of exactly what awaited any state that failed to defend itself. It was in this atmosphere of heightened anxiety and reshuffled alliances that Vlad finally found his path back to power, this time with meaningful Hungarian support rather than fleeting Ottoman patronage. In 1456, following a decisive battle in which the sitting Wallachian ruler, Vladislav II, was killed, Vlad claimed the throne of Wallachia for the second time. He was roughly 25 years old. This time he intended to stay. The Prince Arturns Vlad's second reign, beginning in 1456, is the period historians actually know something meaningful about, because this is when Vlad transitioned from a minor political figure caught between larger powers into a ruler with his own documented policies, correspondence, and reputation. It is also the period from which nearly every famous story about him, whether accurate or wildly exaggerated, ultimately originates. To understand what Vlad inherited, picture Wallachia in 1456 as a country in a state of chronic instability. In the previous few decades alone, the principality had cycled through multiple rulers, several of whom had been violently deposed or assassinated. The boyar class, the country's landed nobility, had grown accustomed to treating princes as temporary and disposable, useful only as long as they served the boyar's own interests. This was precisely the political culture that had gotten Vlad's own father killed 9 years earlier. Vlad seems to have understood, with unusual clarity for a man his age, that he could not rule Wallachia through gentle persuasion or gradual reform. The nobility that had murdered his father and tortured his brother to death were still, in many cases, alive and holding positions of power in his own court. If he ruled softly, he risked becoming the next in a long line of discarded princes. So Vlad made a choice that would define his entire reputation for the next 5.5 centuries. He decided to rule through absolute, uncompromising, and often terrifying consistency. One of his first major acts as ruler, an event that later became the stuff of legend, was to address the boyar class directly and violently. According to several chronicles, though the precise year and details vary between sources, Vlad invited a large gathering of boyars and their families to a feast, ostensibly to celebrate Easter. Partway through the gathering, he had many of the older boyars, those he suspected of involvement in his father's murder or general disloyalty, arrested. Some were executed on the spot. Others, along with their families, were reportedly forced to march on foot, in their fine feast clothing, roughly 50 miles north to the ruins of an old fortress, where they were put to forced labor rebuilding it into a new stronghold. This story, often called the Massacre of the Boyars or the Easter Feast, comes down to us primarily through German pamphlets written decades later, sources with clear political motives to portray Vlad as monstrous, which means historians treat the more theatrical details with real caution. But the broader pattern it describes, a violent and decisive consolidation of power against a hostile nobility, is consistent with everything else we know about how Vlad approached his early reign, and with the specific fortress he is known to have rebuilt using forced labor around this exact period. That fortress deserves its own attention, because it would eventually become the single most famous physical structure associated with Vlad's name, perched high above a river gorge in a location so remote and so difficult to reach that even today it requires a genuine hike simply to visit. We will walk up to it together shortly. But first, it is worth slowing down and asking a quieter question. What did it actually feel like to live in Wallachia during these years, for the people who were neither princes nor boyars, but simply farmers, millers, and blacksmiths trying to get through another winter? The quiet rhythm of ordinary life before we return to castles and campaigns. Let's slow down for a moment and step into an ordinary Wallachian household during Vlad's reign, because the loudest parts of history often drown out the quietest ones, and the quietest ones are usually where most people actually lived their lives. A typical peasant home in this period was small, often a single room shared by an entire family, sometimes with animals brought inside during the harshest winter nights to share body heat and protect them from wolves. The floor was packed earth, occasionally covered with straw. A central hearth provided both heat and light, and the smoke from that hearth usually found its way out through a small hole in the roof rather than a proper chimney, which meant the inside of most homes carried a permanent, faint smell of wood smoke that clung to clothing, hair, and hands. Food followed the rhythm of the seasons with almost no exceptions. Bread, usually made from rye or barley rather than the wheat reserved for wealthier households, formed the backbone of most meals. Vegetables like cabbage, onions, and turnips were staples, often boiled into thick soups or stews that could stretch a small amount of meat across an entire family for days. Meat itself was a luxury for most peasant families, reserved for holidays or slaughtered pigs in late autumn, whose meat was then salted, smoked, or turned into sausages that needed to last through the winter months. Clothing was almost entirely homemade, woven from wool sheared from the family's own sheep or flax grown, and processed into linen through a long, laborious process that occupied much of a household's winter evenings. Dye was expensive and limited, which meant most peasant clothing came in muted, earthy tones, browns and grays, and the occasional faded blue, a stark contrast to the vivid, expensive fabrics worn by boyars and princes, whose reds and purples signaled wealth as clearly as any modern luxury brand. Sound and smell defined daily experience in ways that are easy for us to overlook now. A Wallachian village would have been filled with the noise of livestock, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the creak of wooden cart wheels on dirt roads, and church bells marking the hours in places close enough to a monastery or larger church to hear them. The smells would have been just as vivid: wood smoke, animal dung used as fertilizer and fuel, fresh bread on baking days, and the sharp tang of the tanneries where leather was processed, usually kept at the edge of town due to their overwhelming odor. Religion structured time itself. The Orthodox calendar, filled with feast days, fasting periods, and saints' days, dictated not just spiritual life but practical decisions about when to plant, when to harvest, and when celebration was permitted. Fasting periods, which could be surprisingly long and strict, meant abstaining from meat, dairy, and sometimes even fish for weeks at a time, a practice that shaped diet as much as any agricultural limitation did. For these ordinary families, The political drama consuming Vlad's court, the executed boyars, the Ottoman threat looming to the south, mattered enormously, but in an indirect way. A change in ruler could mean new taxes, new labor demands, or, in the worst cases, an invading army marching directly through their fields and burning what they could not carry away. Peasants had little say in who ruled them, but they had enormous stakes in how that ruler behaved, because a prince at war meant conscription, requisitioned grain, and destroyed crops, while a prince at peace, even a harsh and frightening one, at least offered the possibility of a stable harvest. This is perhaps the most overlooked truth about Vlad's brutal reputation among his own people. While foreign merchants and rival nobles feared and despised him, some Wallachian folk traditions, particularly among common peasants, remembered him rather differently, as a ruler whose harsh justice at least applied evenly, a leader who punished thieves and corrupt officials with the same intensity he punished disloyal nobles. Whether this folk memory reflects genuine historical experience or a later romanticized reconstruction is something historians still debate, but it complicates the simple picture of Vlad as a man universally feared by everyone in his own country. With that quieter picture in mind, let's return to the fortress being built on the cliffs above the Arges River, because the story of its construction says as much about Vlad's methods as any battle he ever fought. Stone by stone, above the river, high above the Arges River, on a narrow ridge accessible only by a steep and exhausting climb, sits what remains of a fortress most people today call Ponari Castle. Long before Vlad's time, an older fortification had existed on this same spot, built by earlier Wallachian rulers to guard a strategic mountain pass. By the time Vlad came to power, that older structure had fallen into disrepair, its walls crumbling, its purpose largely forgotten by anyone except the local villagers who occasionally scavenged its stones. Vlad chose this location for a very deliberate reason. Unlike the lowland capital of Targoviste, which sat exposed and vulnerable on relatively flat terrain, this cliffside position was almost impossible to approach by surprise, and even more difficult to besiege successfully. A prince who had already lost the throne once to a sudden reversal of political fortune wanted, above almost anything else, a place he could retreat to that no army could easily reach. The labor to rebuild this fortress, according to the tradition connected to the Easter feast story mentioned earlier, came from the boyars and their families who had survived Vlad's initial purge. Whether every specific detail of this account is accurate, the broader historical pattern, using forced labor from politically suspect nobility to construct fortifications, was a documented practice in this period, and archaeological evidence at the site does show significant construction activity consistent with Vlad's reign. Picture, for a moment, what this labor would have actually looked like. Stone had to be quarried, often from difficult, uneven terrain, and then hauled up a steep mountain path using nothing but human muscle, rope, and the occasional draft animal capable of managing the incline. Mortar had to be mixed and carried in the same grueling conditions. Workers would have been exposed to the same brutal mountain, whether that made the location so defensible in the first place. Sudden storms, biting winds, and temperatures that swung dramatically between day and night even outside of winter. For nobles accustomed to silk clothing and servants, this forced labor represented not just physical hardship, but a profound social humiliation, a public demonstration that their status meant nothing against the prince's will. This was in many ways the entire point. Vlad was not simply building a castle. He was sending an unmistakable message to every noble family in Wallachia about what happened to those who crossed him, a message written not in words but in stone, sweat, and broken bodies. The finished fortress was modest compared to grand Western European castles of the same period, more a fortified refuge than a palace, with thick walls designed for defense rather than comfort. Its narrow, cliffside footprint meant it could never have housed a large permanent garrison or served as Vlad's primary residence. Instead, it functioned as an emergency stronghold, a place to retreat to when the political weather turned dangerous, which, given everything we have already discussed about Wallachian politics, was a very reasonable thing for a prince to want available. Today, visitors willing to climb the roughly 1,500 steps leading up to the ruins are rewarded with a genuinely breathtaking view over the Arges Valley, forested mountains rolling away in every direction, the river below reduced to a thin silver thread. Very little of the original structure remains standing, most of it lost to time, earthquakes, and according to local tradition, a landslide that eventually claimed one section of the fortress entirely. But the location itself still communicates something the passing centuries have not erased. This was a place built by a man who understood, on a deeply personal level, that power without a secure retreat was no power at all. With his mountain stronghold underway and his most immediate domestic rivals dealt with, Vlad turned his attention to a different kind of threat, one wearing the friendly, familiar face of trade and commerce. The merchants of the mountains just north of Wallachia, across the Carpathian Mountains in the region of Transylvania, sat a cluster of prosperous, largely German-speaking trading towns, among them Brasov and Sibiu. These towns operated under Hungarian political authority, but functioned with considerable independence, built on centuries of accumulated trading wealth. Their merchants had grown accustomed, over generations, to moving goods freely across the mountain passes into Wallachia, often under favorable trading privileges granted by previous, weaker Wallachian princes desperate for Hungarian goodwill. Vlad, upon consolidating his power, looked at these arrangements and saw something that many modern viewers might actually recognize immediately: a set of unequal trade agreements that drained wealth out of his country while offering Wallachia relatively little in return. Foreign merchants were undercutting local Wallachian traders, exporting goods without paying fair customs duties, and, in Vlad's view, treating his principality as an economic resource to be exploited rather than a sovereign state to be respected. His response was characteristically direct. Vlad restricted the trading privileges these Transylvanian merchants had long enjoyed, redirecting commerce through specific towns where it could be properly taxed and monitored, and imposing new tariffs that significantly cut into merchant profits. From a purely economic standpoint, historians generally view these policies as a reasonable, even shrewd, attempt to protect domestic Wallachian commerce and strengthen the crown's finances, which had been badly depleted by decades of political instability and Ottoman tribute payments. Unsurprisingly, the merchants of Brasov and Sibiu did not see it this way at all. They viewed Vlad's new policies as a direct attack on their livelihoods, and they responded with their considerable political influence, appealing to Hungarian authorities and more importantly for how history would remember Vlad, commissioning and circulating written accounts portraying him in the most horrifying possible light. This detail matters enormously because these Transylvanian Saxon communities had one resource that ordinary peasants and even boyars typically lacked: access to the printing press, which had only recently been invented and was spreading rapidly across German-speaking Europe. This is genuinely one of the more overlooked aspects of Vlad's legacy. A significant portion of his monstrous reputation was manufactured, quite literally printed and distributed, by merchants he had economically wronged, using a brand new technology capable of spreading a single story to thousands of readers across multiple cities with unprecedented speed. In a sense, Vlad has the unfortunate distinction of being one of history's earliest victims of what we might now recognize as a coordinated media campaign, even though the specific atrocities these pamphlets described likely blended real events with substantial exaggeration and outright invention. Tensions escalated beyond mere trade disputes and propaganda. According to several accounts, Vlad launched punitive raids into Transylvanian territory in response to merchant defiance and continued political maneuvering against him, targeting towns that had supported rival claimants to the Wallachian throne. These raids reportedly involved significant violence against local populations, including, according to the most sensational later accounts, mass impalements outside city walls meant to serve as a visible warning to anyone considering further resistance. Separating documented fact from later exaggeration here is genuinely difficult, and honest historians acknowledge this difficulty rather than papering over it. We know with reasonable confidence that Vlad did conduct military campaigns into Transylvania and did use impalement as a method of execution, since this punishment appears not only in hostile German sources, but also in more neutral diplomatic correspondence from the period. What remains uncertain is the specific scale, the exact death tolls, and how many of the most gruesome details were embellished by pamphleteers with an obvious financial and political motive to make Vlad appear as monstrous as possible. It is worth pausing here to address that method of execution directly, since it is the single detail most associated with Vlad's name, and understanding it honestly requires setting aside both the horror and the sensationalism for a moment, and looking instead at how a 15th-century mind might have understood it. The logic of fear impalement as a method of execution was not invented by Vlad, nor was it unique to Wallachia. Various forms of this punishment appear across multiple cultures and centuries, including within the Ottoman Empire itself, the very court where Vlad spent his formative teenage years. It is entirely plausible, and many historians consider it likely, that Vlad's specific familiarity with and use of this method traces directly back to his Ottoman captivity, another uncomfortable thread connecting his years as a hostage to his later reign as a ruler. The method itself was designed to be slow, visible, and psychologically devastating, both to the victim and, just as importantly, to anyone who witnessed it or heard about it afterward. Bodies, or in some cases living victims, were displayed publicly for extended periods, sometimes for weeks, along roadsides or outside city walls. This was not incidental cruelty. It was calculated communication. In a world without newspapers, without any mass media beyond word of mouth, and the occasional written account, a visible field of impaled bodies functioned as an unmistakable message, one that required no literacy to understand and traveled along trade routes faster than any written decree could. Contemporary accounts, including the most famous and most disputed one describing a supposed forest of the impaled that Vlad allegedly created to terrify an advancing Ottoman army, describe scenes of deliberate theatrical horror. According to this particular story, when Sultan Mehmed II advanced into Wallachia in 1462, his army encountered a field stretching for a considerable distance, filled with thousands of impaled bodies, including, according to some versions, Ottoman soldiers previously captured by Vlad's forces. The sight is said to have so disturbed even Mehmed, a commander not easily shaken, that it affected Ottoman military morale and contributed to their eventual withdrawal. Historians treat the specific numbers in this account with real skepticism, since ancient and medieval sources routinely inflated casualty figures for dramatic and propagandistic effect, and this particular number, reportedly around 20,000 victims, would represent an enormous logistical undertaking even for a ruler determined to make a statement. What most historians accept as more plausible is that some version of this event did occur, a significant, deliberately terrifying display of impaled bodies meant to demoralize an invading force, even if the specific scale was later exaggerated by chroniclers on both sides for their own reasons. What this event, real or partially exaggerated, tells us about Vlad's broader philosophy of rule is genuinely important. He appears to have operated on a very specific theory, that overwhelming, visible, consistent terror could substitute for military and economic resources he simply did not possess. Wallachia could never match the Ottoman Empire in raw manpower, wealth, or military technology. What it could do, under a ruler willing to use extreme measures without hesitation, was make itself so psychologically costly to invade or oppose that even powerful enemies might think twice. This same underlying logic shaped Vlad's approach to domestic governance as well, and it is here that we find some of the more surprising and genuinely debated stories about his reign, stories that complicate any simple narrative of him as a purely bloodthirsty tyrant. The Golden Cup among the many stories that circulated about Vlad, one stands apart from the rest, because unlike the tales of mass impalement and forest raids, it is not a story of horror at all. It is, strangely enough, a story about honesty, and it appears in multiple independent sources, which gives it slightly more historical weight than some of the more sensational accounts. According to this tradition, Vlad placed a golden cup, or in some versions a golden fountain, in the central square of his capital city, Targoviste, available for any traveler to drink from freely. The remarkable part of the story is not the cup itself, but what happened around it, or rather, what did not happen. Despite sitting unattended in a public square, accessible to anyone passing through, the cup was never stolen. Vlad's punishments for theft, corruption, and dishonesty were reportedly so severe and so consistently enforced that even the temptation of an unguarded golden object could not overcome the fear of consequences. Whether this story is literally true in every detail is impossible to verify, and it may well be more legend than documented fact. But historians find it genuinely useful anyway, not as proof of an actual golden cup, but as evidence of how Vlad wanted to be remembered, and perhaps how at least some of his own subjects actually experienced his reign. This is a very different portrait than the one painted by the Transylvanian merchant pamphlets. Here, Vlad appears not as a chaotic sadist, but as a ruler obsessed with order, so committed to consistent justice that even something as mundane as petty theft became functionally impossible under his watch. This theme of harsh but consistent justice appears repeatedly across the more neutral accounts of his reign. Vlad is described as showing little patience for corruption among his own officials, reportedly applying the same severe punishments to dishonest merchants, lazy or dishonest tax collectors, and even members of his own court who failed to meet his standards. Beggars and the disabled, according to one particularly grim story that historians treat with considerable caution given its extremity, were reportedly gathered together under the pretense of a feast and then killed, Vlad's stated reasoning being that he wished to eliminate poverty from his realm entirely by eliminating the poor themselves rather than addressing the conditions that created poverty. This particular story illustrates something important about how we should approach Vlad's reign as a whole. Some accounts describe a ruler obsessed with fairness and order to the point of near obsessive consistency. Other accounts describe a ruler capable of shocking, indiscriminate cruelty toward the most vulnerable members of his own society. These two portraits are not necessarily contradictory. A ruler who genuinely believed that harsh, universal consequences created social order could, within that same worldview, view poverty itself as a kind of disorder to be eliminated by whatever means seemed most efficient, however monstrous that logic appears to us now. It is also worth noting, in fairness to Vlad, that not every harsh medieval ruler's actions were recorded with equal thoroughness or equal hostility. Vlad's reputation was shaped disproportionately by enemies with strong political and financial motives to portray him in the worst possible light, while rulers who committed comparable or even worse atrocities against their own populations, but who did not happen to anger literate merchant communities with access to the printing press, often escaped similar historical infamy. This does not excuse whatever Vlad actually did. It simply means we should read the surviving sources with an awareness of who wrote them, and why. Beneath all of this, in the quiet spaces between executions and political maneuvering, ordinary court life continued, and it is worth spending a moment inside the walls of Targoviste itself, imagining what it might have felt like to actually live and work within Vlad's princely court during these tense, watchful years. Inside the princely court Targoviste, Vlad's primary capital during much of his reign, was not a grand city by the standards of Western Europe, but it was the political and administrative heart of Wallachia, home to the princely court, a growing merchant quarter, and a scattering of churches and monasteries that served as the intellectual centers of the realm. The princely residence itself combined elements of fortress and palace, thick defensive walls surrounding chambers decorated, at least for the wealthy inhabitants, with imported textiles, carved woodwork, and the occasional luxury item brought in through the very trade routes Vlad worked so hard to control. Life inside this court would have followed a rhythm shaped almost entirely by the prince's own schedule and mood, which, given everything we have discussed, could not have made for a relaxing working environment. Court officials, scribes, and advisors needed to be constantly attentive, since Vlad's expectations for competence and honesty left little room for error. A tax collector who skimmed funds, a scribe who made careless mistakes in official correspondence, or an advisor who offered poor counsel risked consequences far more severe than simple dismissal. And yet, court life was not purely an atmosphere of terror. Diplomatic correspondence needed to be drafted and dispatched to Hungarian, Moldavian, and occasionally even Ottoman contacts, requiring skilled scribes fluent in multiple languages, including Church Slavonic, the language used for most official Wallachian documents during this period, alongside Latin for correspondence with Western courts. Vlad himself, given his years of Ottoman education alongside his native Romanian upbringing, was likely fluent or at least functional in multiple languages, an unusual and valuable skill for a ruler navigating such a complex political landscape. Meals within the princely court would have reflected the prince's wealth and status far more visibly than anything available to ordinary peasants. Imported spices, wine brought up from the Mediterranean or from Hungarian vineyards, and meat prepared in far greater variety and quantity than most subjects would ever taste in their entire lives, all would have graced the tables of Vlad's inner circle, even as the surrounding countryside continued its endless cycle of subsistence farming and seasonal scarcity. Clothing at court followed similarly stark contrasts with the general population. Fine wool, silk imported through Ottoman or Italian trade networks, and fur trim, particularly from the abundant forests surrounding the Carpathian Mountains, marked the boyars and court officials as distinctly separate from the peasantry, even those boyars who had survived Vlad's earlier purges and now served him, whether out of genuine loyalty or simple, well-founded fear. Music and entertainment, though far less documented than political events, almost certainly existed within this court environment, since surviving records from neighboring courts of the same period describe traveling musicians, storytellers, and occasional theatrical performances marking major feast days and diplomatic celebrations. Whether Vlad himself enjoyed such entertainments, or whether his court maintained the grim, watchful atmosphere suggested by so many surviving accounts even during moments of celebration, is something the historical record simply does not tell us with any confidence. What we do know is that this entire delicate, tense system, a court balancing genuine administrative competence against constant fear, a prince obsessed with order ruling a nobility that had murdered his father, was operating under the looming shadow of an even larger threat. To the south, across the Danube, an Ottoman sultan was watching Wallachia's increasingly defiant prince with growing impatience, and that patience was about to run out entirely. The tribute that was never paid since regaining his throne, Vlad had maintained a careful, if uneasy, relationship with the Ottoman Empire, technically a vassal state obligated to pay an annual tribute in gold, and more painfully, in young boys taken to serve in the Ottoman military system known as the Devshirme, the very system that had once claimed Vlad and his brother as children. For several years, this tribute continued, a bitter but pragmatic acknowledgement of Ottoman power that Vlad, of all people, understood better than almost any ruler in Europe. But sometime around 1459 or 1460, Vlad made a decision that historians widely regard as the true turning point of his reign, the moment that transformed him from a regional ruler managing difficult neighbors into a figure of genuine European significance. He stopped paying the tribute. This was not a decision made lightly, nor was it made in isolation. Vlad had been in secret negotiations with Hungarian authorities, exploring the possibility of a broader anti-Ottoman alliance, and there is reason to believe he calculated, correctly or not, that open defiance might finally position Wallachia as a serious partner in the wider Christian resistance against Ottoman expansion, rather than a marginal buffer state simply trying to survive. Whatever his precise motivations, the tribute stopped, and shortly afterward, Vlad escalated the confrontation dramatically. According to the most famous account of this episode, Sultan Mehmed II sent 2 envoys to Wallachia to demand the overdue tribute and, according to custom, to receive a formal greeting from Vlad. When these envoys, following their own religious custom, declined to remove their turbans in Vlad's presence, considering it inappropriate to bare their heads before anyone but their own sultan, Vlad reportedly ordered the turbans nailed directly to their heads, declaring that he would help them keep their customs permanently in place. This story has become one of the most famous anecdotes associated with Vlad, repeated in countless retellings, and it captures something essential about his approach to power even if its precise details cannot be fully verified through independent contemporary sources. Whether the nails were literal or the story grew more vivid with each retelling, the underlying message would have been unmistakable to everyone who heard it. Vlad was not simply refusing payment. He was publicly, deliberately humiliating representatives of the most powerful empire in the region, an act of defiance that left no room for quiet diplomatic backpedaling. Mehmed's response came swiftly. He attempted, first, a more subtle approach, inviting Vlad to a diplomatic meeting that may have been intended as a trap to capture or kill him quietly, away from the battlefield. Vlad, whether through intelligence networks, sheer suspicion born of years navigating exactly this kind of political treachery, or simple good fortune, avoided the trap. Rather than accepting the invitation, he launched a preemptive strike of his own, crossing the Danube into Ottoman-controlled territory during the winter of 1461 into 1462, and conducting a devastating campaign against Ottoman settlements along the border. This winter campaign, launched at a time of year when most medieval armies avoided major military action, showcased Vlad's willingness to break conventional expectations when it served his strategic advantage. His forces reportedly killed tens of thousands of people, soldiers and civilians alike, and destroyed numerous settlements, a campaign whose brutality even Vlad himself apparently reported with something approaching pride in surviving correspondence to Hungarian allies, describing the scale of destruction as evidence of his commitment to the anti-Ottoman cause. This campaign made war with the Ottoman Empire not merely likely, but absolutely certain. Sultan Mehmed II, fresh off his conquest of Constantinople less than a decade earlier, and widely regarded as one of the most capable military commanders of his generation, began assembling a massive invasion force to march north into Wallachia and remove this defiant prince permanently. The confrontation that followed would become the defining military episode of Vlad's entire life. The night attack in the summer of 1462, Sultan Mehmed II crossed the Danube into Wallachia at the head of an army whose size, according to contemporary sources, may have numbered somewhere between 60 and 90,000 soldiers, a force that dwarfed anything Vlad could hope to field in direct, open battle. Modern historians treat these specific numbers with appropriate caution, since medieval chroniclers routinely inflated army sizes for dramatic effect. But even accounting for exaggeration, the Ottoman force represented an overwhelming numerical advantage. Vlad, fully aware that he could not win a conventional battle against this force, adopted a strategy that historians now recognize as remarkably sophisticated for its time, one that modern military analysts sometimes describe using the language of scorched earth and guerrilla warfare, even though those specific terms did not exist yet in the 15th century. Rather than meeting the Ottoman army in open combat, Vlad ordered a systematic evacuation and destruction of everything in the invading army's path. Villages were abandoned, wells were poisoned or filled in, crops were burned, and livestock was driven away or slaughtered rather than left for Ottoman soldiers to requisition. This strategy inflicted a slower, quieter kind of damage on the invading force than any single battle could have. Soldiers accustomed to living off captured supplies as they advanced found nothing but ash, empty villages, and poisoned water sources. Disease, always a constant companion to any large medieval army regardless of the campaign's success, began spreading through Ottoman ranks, worsened by contaminated water and the physical exhaustion of marching through hostile, emptied territory during the peak heat of summer. The most famous single episode of this entire campaign occurred on the night of June 16th to 17th, in what history now calls the night attack. Vlad, gathering a relatively small force, reportedly infiltrated the Ottoman camp under cover of darkness with the specific goal of assassinating Sultan Mehmed himself. According to surviving accounts, Vlad's forces moved through the camp with brutal efficiency, killing soldiers in their tents and creating widespread chaos and confusion, though they ultimately failed to locate and kill Mehmed, who survived the attack, according to some accounts because Vlad's forces mistakenly attacked the tents of viziers rather than the Sultan's actual location. The psychological impact of this attack, even in failure, was considerable. An army numbering in the tens of thousands had been infiltrated and thrown into disarray by a much smaller force operating under cover of night, a humiliating demonstration that raw numerical superiority offered no guarantee of safety against a determined and creative opponent operating on his own home territory. Combined with the ongoing effects of disease, exhaustion, and the psychological toll of advancing through a landscape deliberately emptied and poisoned by its own inhabitants, Ottoman morale had begun to genuinely suffer. It was in the days following this attack, according to the most famous and most disputed account of the entire campaign, that Mehmed's forces encountered the scene we discussed earlier, the field of impaled bodies stretching for a considerable distance outside one of Vlad's strongholds. Whatever the precise scale of this display, the combination of guerrilla tactics, disease, logistical exhaustion, and outright psychological horror appears to have genuinely shaken Ottoman resolve, contributing to Mehmed's eventual decision to withdraw the bulk of his forces from Wallachia rather than press forward toward a decisive confrontation. This should have been Vlad's greatest triumph, a Wallachian prince successfully resisting the full might of the Ottoman Empire through sheer tactical brilliance and ruthless determination. And in the annals of pure military achievement, it genuinely was. But military victory and political survival, in this era and in this particular corner of Europe, were two entirely different things, and Vlad was about to discover, in the most painful way possible, that winning a war against a foreign empire meant very little if your own allies decided you had become more dangerous than useful. Betrayed from within while maimed withdrew the bulk of his invading force, he left behind a smaller Ottoman army along with Vlad's own younger brother, Radu, the same Radu who had grown comfortable with an Ottoman court life during their shared childhood captivity. Radu was now positioned as an alternative candidate for the Wallachian throne, a familiar, and from the Ottoman perspective, far more manageable option than his defiant older brother. What followed was not a foreign conquest in the traditional sense, but something more painful and more quietly devastating, a slow political collapse from within Vlad's own territory. Exhausted by years of warfare, forced labor, heavy taxation to fund military campaigns, and the general instability that had characterized Vlad's entire reign, significant portions of the Wallachian boyar class began to shift their support toward Radu, calculating, not unreasonably, that continued loyalty to Vlad meant continued Ottoman hostility, endless warfare, and the very real possibility of a much larger, much more devastating invasion in the near future. This is one of the more genuinely tragic ironies of Vlad's story. His entire approach to rule, brutal, absolute consistency, designed to prevent exactly this kind of boyar betrayal, ultimately failed to prevent the very outcome it was built to avoid. The boyars, weighing their own survival and their family's safety against loyalty to an increasingly isolated and militarily depleted prince, chose the path of least resistance. Vlad's support base eroded rapidly throughout late 1462, and by the end of that year, he found himself without sufficient domestic backing to continue effectively resisting both Radu's faction and the remaining Ottoman military presence. Vlad's response to this collapsing situation reveals something important about his political calculations even in crisis. Rather than continuing a doomed resistance within Wallachia itself, he made the decision to flee north into Transylvania, seeking refuge with his supposed ally, the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus, son of the very John Hunyadi whose actions had led to Vlad's father's execution years earlier. This was, on paper, a reasonable decision. Hungary had a clear strategic interest in supporting anti-Ottoman rulers throughout the region, and Matthias Corvinus had inherited both his father's military reputation and his father's broader commitment to resisting Ottoman expansion in the Balkans. What Vlad received instead was one of the more startling betrayals in an already betrayal-filled story. Rather than welcoming Vlad as a valuable anti-Ottoman ally deserving of protection and support, Matthias Corvinus had him arrested almost immediately upon his arrival in Hungarian territory. The official justification, later formalized through a set of forged, or at minimum heavily manipulated letters supposedly written by Vlad himself, claimed that Vlad had actually been secretly negotiating with the Ottomans, offering to betray Hungarian interests in exchange for favorable treatment. Most historians today view these letters with deep suspicion, considering them likely fabrications created specifically to justify Matthias Corvinus's decision to imprison Vlad rather than support him militarily. The more probable explanation, according to many historians studying the political context, is considerably more cynical and considerably more practical from Matthias's perspective. Supporting a full-scale Wallachian resistance against the Ottoman Empire would have required significant Hungarian military and financial commitment, at a moment when Matthias faced other pressing political priorities. Imprisoning Vlad, while publicly maintaining the appearance of opposing Ottoman expansion, allowed Matthias to avoid that costly commitment while still claiming credit domestically for containing the Ottoman-aligned threat that Radu's new pro-Ottoman regime theoretically represented. Whatever the precise truth behind his arrest, the practical outcome for Vlad was unambiguous and severe. The prince who had successfully humiliated the Ottoman Sultan's own invasion force found himself instead imprisoned by the very Christian ally he had hoped would support his continued resistance, beginning a captivity that would last, with varying degrees of severity, for more than a decade. Years behind Hungarian walls, Vlad's Hungarian imprisonment, which began around late 1462, is one of the more curious and least understood periods of his entire life, largely because the conditions of his captivity appear to have shifted considerably over its duration, and the surviving sources disagree meaningfully about exactly how harshly or how comfortably he was actually treated. For at least the early portion of his imprisonment, historical evidence suggests Vlad was held under genuinely restrictive conditions, likely at Visegrad Castle, a significant Hungarian royal fortress situated along the Danube north of Buda. Some later accounts, though these should be treated with the same historical caution applied to other second-hand chronicles from this period, describe particularly grim conditions during this early phase, even suggesting Vlad occupied himself by capturing and impaling small animals, insects, and rodents within his cell, a detail that, whether factually accurate or a later embellishment, meant to reinforce his monstrous reputation even in captivity, has become a persistent part of his popular legend. What we can say with somewhat greater confidence is that Vlad's conditions improved substantially as his imprisonment continued, likely reflecting evolving Hungarian political calculations rather than any particular personal transformation on Vlad's part. As the broader regional political situation shifted, and as Matthias Corvinus found continued value in maintaining Vlad as a potential future asset against Ottoman interests rather than a permanently discarded prisoner, Vlad appears to have been gradually granted greater freedom, better living conditions, and eventually even a degree of integration into Hungarian court society itself. Perhaps the most significant development during this captivity was Vlad's marriage to a woman connected to the Hungarian royal family, generally believed by historians to have been a relative of Matthias Corvinus himself, though the exact relationship remains somewhat unclear in the surviving records. This marriage produced at least 2 sons, and it represented a genuine, if politically convenient, integration into Hungarian aristocratic life for a man who had spent most of his adult existence as either a hostage, a fugitive, or a prisoner. Alongside this marriage came another significant transformation: Vlad's conversion from Orthodox Christianity to Roman Catholicism, the dominant faith of the Hungarian court. This conversion should be understood within its full political context, rather than as a simple matter of personal spiritual conviction. Catholic conversion was, quite practically, a prerequisite for meaningful integration into Hungarian aristocratic and political life, and a man hoping to eventually reclaim his throne with Hungarian backing had strong practical incentives to align himself religiously with his most powerful potential patron. This period of Vlad's life offers a genuinely different portrait than the one most popular accounts emphasize. Here was a man in his mid-30s, having already survived Ottoman hostage-taking as a child, the murder of his father and brother, two brief and violent reigns, a major war against the most powerful empire in the region, and a betrayal by his own supposed ally, now settling, at least temporarily, into a quieter domestic existence, married, raising young sons, practicing a new faith, and navigating the far gentler, if still politically fraught, currents of Hungarian court life. It would not last. By the early 1470s, the regional political situation had shifted once again, and Radu, Vlad's brother, who had ruled Wallachia as an Ottoman client for nearly a decade, was facing his own mounting difficulties, creating an opening that Matthias Corvinus and Vlad himself could not resist exploiting. A third and final throne, Radu's rule over Wallachia, spanning roughly a decade as an Ottoman-aligned prince, had never been especially secure, resting as it did on continuous Ottoman military and political backing, rather than any deep domestic loyalty among the Wallachian nobility. By 1473 and 1474, Radu's position was weakening considerably, worsened by his own declining health, and by 1475 he had died, reportedly from illness, leaving the Wallachian throne once again genuinely contested. Meanwhile, Vlad, having spent over a decade in Hungarian custody and subsequent integration into Hungarian court life, found himself, somewhat unexpectedly, positioned as a potentially valuable political asset once again. Matthias Corvinus, weighing the regional situation and Vlad's still considerable reputation as a committed and effective anti-Ottoman commander, decided to support Vlad's return to power in Wallachia, hoping to re-establish a genuinely anti-Ottoman ruler in this strategically vital buffer territory. In 1476, with combined Hungarian and Moldavian military support, Vlad launched a campaign to reclaim the Wallachian throne for a third and final time. This campaign proved successful, and by November of that year, Vlad had retaken Targoviste and re-established himself as Wallachia's ruling prince, roughly 14 years after his initial fall from power and subsequent imprisonment. This third reign, however, would prove to be almost impossibly brief, lasting only about 2 months before Vlad's death brought his remarkable, turbulent life to its final, and still genuinely mysterious, conclusion. Historians studying this final period note that Vlad's domestic support base remained fragile even upon his restoration, since many of the same boyars who had shifted allegiance to Radu years earlier, and who had grown accustomed to a decade of relative peace under Ottoman-aligned rule, viewed Vlad's return with considerable ambivalence rather than genuine enthusiasm. The military forces that had helped restore Vlad to power were also, notably, relatively modest in size, consisting largely of Hungarian and Moldavian troops rather than a substantial domestic Wallachian army, meaning Vlad's grip on power rested on foreign military backing that could, and eventually did, prove unreliable when circumstances shifted. This precarious foundation would prove decisive in the events that followed almost immediately after his restoration. The final battle, the most widely accepted account of Vlad's death, places the event in either late December of 1476 or early January of 1477, during a military confrontation with Ottoman forces, or possibly with rival Wallachian factions supported by Ottoman interests, somewhere near the Wallachian capital, though the exact location remains genuinely disputed among historians studying the period. The circumstances of his death carry a striking irony that historians frequently note. A man who had survived Ottoman hostage-taking, multiple exiles, a major war against the Ottoman Empire's full military might, and over a decade of Hungarian imprisonment, ultimately died in a relatively minor military engagement, seemingly ambushed or overwhelmed by a smaller Ottoman-aligned force, rather than falling in some grand, decisive battle befitting the dramatic arc of his life story. Some accounts suggest Vlad was killed by his own soldiers, either through simple confusion amid the chaos of battle, or in a more unsettling possibility that several historians consider plausible given the persistent instability of his domestic support, through deliberate betrayal by boyars who had never fully reconciled themselves to his restoration. Other accounts describe him being killed directly by Ottoman forces during the engagement itself. The historical record, frustratingly but not surprisingly given everything else we have discussed about the reliability of sources from this period, does not allow us to determine with full confidence which version is accurate. What happened to Vlad's body afterward adds yet another layer of genuine historical mystery to an already uncertain death. According to the most widely repeated account, Vlad's head was severed from his body and sent to Constantinople, where it was reportedly displayed on a stake as proof of his death, and as a symbolic demonstration of the Ottoman Empire's continued dominance over its defiant former vassal, a grim final echo of the very method of execution Vlad himself had used so extensively throughout his reign. The fate of the rest of his body is where the historical trail grows even murkier, and where the story connects directly back to the quiet monastery scene we opened with tonight. Tradition holds that Vlad's body, or at least what remained of it, was buried at Snagov Monastery, a secluded religious site built on a small island surrounded by a lake north of Targoviste, a location that had reportedly received Vlad's patronage and support during his reigns, making it a logical resting place for a ruler with genuine, if complicated, religious devotion. The empty grave for centuries, the story of Vlad's burial at Snagov Monastery, was accepted largely without serious challenge, a plausible, tidy ending to an otherwise chaotic and violent life. An unmarked stone slab near the monastery's altar was long identified by local tradition as marking his final resting place, a fittingly humble and mysterious grave for a ruler whose entire life had been defined by precariousness and uncertainty. In the early 20th century, however, archaeological investigation at Snagov Monastery produced a discovery that complicated this tidy narrative considerably. When researchers excavated beneath the traditionally identified grave site, they found, according to the most commonly cited accounts of this excavation, no human remains at all, only animal bones and various pottery fragments, suggesting either that Vlad had never actually been buried in that specific location, or that his remains had been removed or relocated at some point after their initial interment, for reasons that remain entirely unclear. This discovery opened the door to a range of alternative theories that historians and archaeologists have continued investigating and debating in the decades since. Some researchers have pointed to a separate grave found elsewhere within the same monastery complex, located near the entrance rather than close to the altar, containing remains accompanied by fragments of fabric and decorative elements, suggesting a burial of genuine nobility. Though whether these remains actually belong to Vlad himself has never been conclusively proven through any scientific method considered definitive by the broader historical and archaeological community. More recently, additional theories have emerged connecting Vlad's remains to entirely different locations. Some researchers have pointed to findings at a church in Naples, Italy, noting a documented connection between Vlad's daughter, who reportedly relocated to Naples following her father's death, and a set of unidentified remains discovered at a chapel there featuring imagery, including a dragon motif, that some researchers have connected to Vlad's own family heraldry, connected to the Order of the Dragon discussed earlier. This theory, while genuinely intriguing, remains speculative, and no conclusive scientific confirmation, such as verified DNA testing linking these remains directly to Vlad or his confirmed descendants, has been established. What makes this ongoing mystery genuinely fascinating, rather than simply frustrating, is what it reveals about the broader challenge of studying a figure who existed at the exact intersection of documented history and rapidly developing legend. Vlad was significant enough to generate written records, diplomatic correspondence, and chronicled accounts of his reign, yet obscure enough, and his burial evidently informal enough, that even something as fundamental as the location of his own remains was never definitively recorded or preserved with the careful documentation that might have prevented centuries of subsequent uncertainty. This uncertainty, this genuine, unresolved historical mystery sitting at the very end of Vlad's life, mirrors something important about his entire story. Nearly everything about this man exists in a fog somewhere between documented fact and constructed legend, and nowhere is that fog thicker than in the final resting place of his own body, a fittingly mysterious ending for a life that historians are still, 5.5 centuries later, working to fully untangle from the myth that eventually consumed it. A quiet interlude, the Forest AT Night. Let's slow down for a moment before we continue into the story of how Vlad's legend grew larger than the man himself. It's worth simply sitting, for a little while, inside the physical world he actually inhabited, because that world had a texture and a rhythm entirely its own, one that existed quite apart from politics and warfare. Imagine a Wallachian forest at night during this period, the kind of dense woodland that once covered enormous stretches of the Carpathian foothills. Without any artificial light beyond scattered candles or torches in distant villages, darkness in this landscape was absolute in a way almost nobody experiences today. The forest floor would have been carpeted with fallen leaves and pine needles, damp and soft underfoot, while overhead, an uninterrupted canopy blocked all but the faintest traces of moonlight on all but the clearest nights. Sound traveled strangely through these old forests. The distant call of an owl, the snap of a branch under some unseen animal's weight, the low, steady rush of a nearby stream, all of it seemed amplified by the sheer stillness surrounding it. Wolves, still common throughout this region during the 15th century, added their distant howls to the nighttime chorus, a sound that would have carried genuine, practical danger for anyone caught outside village walls after dark, particularly during the harsh winter months when hunger drove predators closer to human settlements. Snow, when it fell across this landscape, transformed everything. It muffled sound almost entirely, turning the forest into something close to silence, broken only by the soft creak of branches under accumulated weight, or the occasional soft collapse of snow sliding from a laden bough. Rivers, including the Arges below Vlad's mountain fortress, would partially freeze along their edges even as the central current continued flowing, dark water visible through gaps in pale ice, a landscape simultaneously frozen and alive. Villages during winter nights would have glowed faintly against this darkness, firelight flickering through small windows covered not with glass, which remained an expensive luxury even for wealthier households, but often with stretched, oiled parchment or simple wooden shutters that let through only the thinnest suggestion of interior warmth. The smell of wood smoke would have hung low over these settlements on cold, still nights, mixing with the earthier smell of livestock kept close to human dwellings for shared warmth. For anyone traveling through this landscape after dark, whether a merchant moving between towns, a monk traveling between monasteries, or a soldier moving with Vlad's own forces during his various campaigns, the experience would have been one of genuine physical vulnerability to the natural world in a way modern life rarely requires. Every journey carried real risk from weather, wildlife, and simple exhaustion, risks that existed entirely independent of the political dangers we have spent so much time discussing. It's worth remembering this physical reality as we move forward into the story of Vlad's legend, because the terrifying image that eventually consumed his historical memory, a supernatural monster haunting dark forests, drew much of its power from an environment that was, in its own way, already genuinely unsettling to anyone unfamiliar with it. The forests of Wallachia and Transylvania needed very little embellishment to feel mysterious and threatening to outside observers. Writers centuries later would simply need to add one more shadow to a landscape that already held plenty. Ink and printing presses. We touched earlier on how Vlad's conflicts with Transylvanian merchants contributed to his monstrous reputation, but it's worth returning to this subject in more depth, because the printed pamphlets that emerged from this conflict represent one of history's earliest and most effective examples of what we might now recognize as a coordinated smear campaign, made possible by a genuinely revolutionary new technology. Johannes Gutenberg's printing press, developed in the German city of Mainz around 1440, had spread with remarkable speed across German-speaking Europe by the time of Vlad's conflicts with Brasov and Sibiu in the 1450s and 1460s. This technology allowed, for the first time in European history, the rapid, relatively cheap production of multiple copies of a single text, transforming how information and misinformation could travel across the continent. The German pamphlets describing Vlad's atrocities, produced primarily in the decades following his death, drew heavily on the grievances of the Transylvanian merchant communities he had economically antagonized, and they described his reign in language deliberately calibrated to shock and horrify their German-speaking readership. These pamphlets described mass impalements in numbers that strain credibility, elaborate tortures that historians consider likely invented or wildly exaggerated, and a general portrait of a ruler consumed by senseless, almost supernatural cruelty rather than the calculated, if brutal, political logic that more careful historical analysis suggests actually motivated most of his documented actions. What made these pamphlets so effective and so historically consequential was not merely their content but their format and distribution. Unlike traditional handwritten chronicles, limited to single copies laboriously produced by scribes, these printed pamphlets could be produced in dozens or hundreds of copies and distributed across multiple German cities simultaneously, reaching a far wider audience than any previous form of political propaganda had managed to achieve. Some of these pamphlets even included woodcut illustrations, visual depictions of Vlad's alleged atrocities that would have made a powerful impression even on illiterate viewers who could not read the accompanying text. Perhaps most significantly, these pamphlets attracted the attention of a printing press operating in Nuremberg that produced a particularly influential and widely circulated version, one that historians believe played a direct role in shaping how Vlad was perceived not just among German merchants with direct grievances against him, but across broader European audiences who had no personal stake in Wallachian politics at all. This transformation from a regional political figure with genuine enemies and genuine defenders into a broader European symbol of exotic, almost cartoonish cruelty happened remarkably quickly, within just a few decades of his actual death. It is worth noting, in fairness to historical balance, that not every account produced during this period was uniformly hostile. Russian chronicles, produced independently of the German pamphlet tradition and reflecting entirely different political interests, offer a notably different portrait of Vlad, one we should examine closely, because it complicates the simple narrative of a universally despised tyrant considerably. A different story from the East. While German pamphlets were busy transforming Vlad into a symbol of senseless cruelty for Western European audiences, a very different literary tradition was developing simultaneously in Russia, one that historians find genuinely fascinating precisely because it reaches many of the same factual events, the executions, the impalements, the harsh punishments, and interprets them through an entirely different lens. Russian tales about Vlad, believed to have been compiled sometime in the late 15th century, likely drawing on accounts brought back by Russian diplomats or travelers who had visited Hungary during Vlad's imprisonment there, present him not primarily as a monster, but as a stern, uncompromising, yet fundamentally effective ruler, one whose harsh justice, however brutal in its methods, produced genuine order and stability within his territory. These accounts describe the same Golden Cup story mentioned earlier, presenting it not as an isolated curious anecdote, but as central evidence of Vlad's success in eliminating crime and dishonesty through sheer force of consistent, uncompromising punishment. This more favorable Russian portrayal makes considerably more sense once you understand the political context in which it was produced. Russia during this period was itself consolidating centralized authority under increasingly powerful rulers, a political project that required exactly the kind of harsh, centralized justice against a traditionally powerful, often disloyal nobility that Vlad had attempted, however brutally, in his own conflicts against the Wallachian boyar class. From this particular political vantage point, Vlad's methods looked less like senseless cruelty and more like a cautionary but ultimately admirable model for how a determined ruler might successfully break the power of an unruly aristocracy. This divergence between German and Russian portrayals offers a genuinely important lesson about how we should approach historical reputation more broadly. The same set of documented actions, harsh executions, brutal punishments, uncompromising justice, could be framed as either monstrous cruelty or effective, necessary governance, depending entirely on the political interests and cultural values of whoever happened to be writing the account. Neither portrayal is necessarily more historically accurate than the other in a purely factual sense. Both drew on genuine events. But both also shaped and selected those events according to what served their respective political purposes. For centuries following his death, these two competing traditions, the horrified German pamphlets and the more admiring Russian chronicles, existed largely in parallel, read by different audiences with different political interests, neither one achieving the kind of overwhelming, singular cultural dominance that would eventually transform Vlad from a genuinely complicated historical figure into the singular cultural icon he represents today. That transformation required one more crucial ingredient, one that had nothing to do with Wallachian politics at all, and everything to do with a struggling Irish writer working in London several centuries later, searching for the perfect name for a fictional vampire. The novelist who borrowed a name in 1897, an Irish writer and theater manager named Bram Stoker, published a novel called Dracula, and in doing so, he permanently, irreversibly changed how the entire world would remember a 15th-century Wallachian prince who had been dead for over 400 years. It is worth being precise here about exactly what Stoker did and did not draw from Vlad's actual life, because popular understanding of this connection is often considerably muddier than the historical reality. Stoker's research notes, which survive and have been studied extensively by literary historians, indicate that he encountered the name Dracula while reading a book about the history of Wallachia and Moldavia, and was apparently drawn to the name specifically because he learned that, in the local language, it could be understood to mean devil, a meaning we discussed earlier in connection with Vlad's father's own nickname. Beyond borrowing this evocative name, however, Stoker's actual novel draws remarkably little from the documented details of Vlad's specific life and reign. Stoker's fictional Count Dracula is not a 15th-century prince engaged in political struggles against the Ottoman Empire and rebellious boyars. He is a supernatural, centuries-old vampire living in a Transylvanian castle, entirely divorced from the specific historical events, wars, and political conflicts that actually defined Vlad's real existence. Some literary scholars argue Stoker may have known and incorporated a handful of additional biographical details, possibly including vague awareness of Vlad's historical reputation for cruelty, but the overwhelming majority of the novel's plot, characters, and supernatural elements are pure Victorian Gothic invention, owing far more to earlier vampire folklore and Stoker's own literary imagination than to any careful study of actual Wallachian history. And yet, the cultural impact of this literary connection proved absolutely enormous, far beyond anything Stoker himself likely anticipated. As Dracula grew into one of the most successful and influential novels in the English language, later adapted into countless films, television shows, and other cultural productions throughout the 20th century and beyond, the name Dracula became permanently, inseparably linked in popular imagination with vampires, supernatural horror, and Gothic fiction, rather than with the actual historical prince whose family nickname had originally inspired it. This cultural transformation created a strange, layered historical irony that persists to this day. Most people encountering the name Dracula for the first time, particularly through film and popular media, assume they are encountering a purely fictional character with no historical basis whatsoever. When they later learn that a real historical figure named Vlad actually existed and directly inspired the name, many assume, quite reasonably given how thoroughly the fictional vampire has saturated popular culture, that this real prince must have been some kind of literal monster, an assumption the German pamphlets from centuries earlier had already primed European audiences to accept. Even though the specific supernatural elements of vampirism have absolutely no basis in anything documented about Vlad's actual life or death, modern tourism in Romania has, understandably, both embraced and struggled with this complicated legacy. Bran Castle, a genuinely impressive medieval fortress in Transylvania, has become closely associated with Dracula tourism, despite the fact that Vlad's actual historical connection to this specific castle is tenuous at best, resting on possible, brief, and poorly documented visits rather than any sustained residence or ownership. Meanwhile, Ponari Castle, the fortress Vlad actually built and genuinely used as his primary defensive stronghold, remains far less visited, a remote ruin requiring a genuinely difficult climb, overshadowed by a more accessible castle whose primary claim to fame rests on fictional literary association rather than documented historical connection. This gap between the two castles captures something essential about Vlad's entire posthumous legacy. The version of his story that captured global imagination, the supernatural vampire count residing in a picturesque Transylvanian castle, bears only the thinnest connection to the version of his story that historians have carefully reconstructed through surviving chronicles, diplomatic correspondence, and archaeological evidence. A story of a genuinely complicated political figure navigating impossible circumstances with a combination of tactical brilliance and horrifying brutality that defies simple categorization as either purely heroic or purely monstrous. What the evidence actually shows, having spent considerable time now separating documented history from later legend, it's worth pausing to consider, directly and honestly, what historians studying Vlad's life today generally agree upon, where genuine scholarly disagreement still exists, and where the evidence simply remains too thin to support confident conclusions in either direction. On the question of impalement as a method of execution, historians broadly agree that Vlad genuinely used this punishment extensively, a conclusion supported not only by the more hostile German pamphlets, but also by more neutral diplomatic correspondence and by the more favorable Russian chronicles, both of which independently confirm this practice even while interpreting its significance very differently. Where genuine uncertainty remains is in the specific numbers involved in individual incidents, since medieval sources across virtually every culture routinely inflated casualty figures for dramatic or propagandistic effect, and modern historians generally treat the largest reported numbers, tens of thousands of victims in single incidents, with considerable skepticism regarding their literal accuracy. On the question of Vlad's broader psychological character, the picture historians have assembled is genuinely more complicated than either the purely monstrous or purely heroic popular portrayals suggest. The consistent theme across nearly every source, hostile and favorable alike, is Vlad's obsession with order, consistency, and absolute, uncompromising punishment for perceived disloyalty or dishonesty. Whether this obsession stemmed primarily from his childhood experience as an Ottoman hostage, from the specific trauma of his father's and brother's violent deaths, from broader cultural and political pressures unique to Wallachia's precarious geographic position, or from some combination of all of these factors, remains a matter of scholarly interpretation rather than settled historical fact. On the question of Vlad's military capabilities, there is considerably less controversy. Even historians generally skeptical of the more sensational atrocity stories acknowledge that his 1462 campaign against the Ottoman Empire, combining scorched earth tactics, guerrilla warfare, and psychological terror, represented a genuinely sophisticated military response to an overwhelming numerical disadvantage, one that succeeded, at least temporarily, in halting one of the most capable military commanders of the entire era. On the question of his final death and burial, as we discussed earlier, genuine, unresolved historical mystery remains. The most basic facts, that Vlad died in battle sometime in late 1476 or early 1477, and that his head was likely sent to Constantinople as proof of his death, enjoy relatively broad historical acceptance. But the precise circumstances of his death, whether by Ottoman forces, by his own soldiers, or through deliberate boyar betrayal, and the actual final location of his remaining remains, continue to generate legitimate scholarly debate without any clear resolution currently available. Perhaps the most important broader conclusion historians have reached, after decades of careful research separating documented fact from later legend, is this: Vlad was neither the senseless, supernatural monster that centuries of hostile propaganda and later Gothic fiction transformed him into, nor was he a simple, straightforwardly heroic defender of Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion, as some more sympathetic modern accounts sometimes suggest. He was something considerably more historically interesting than either extreme. A genuinely capable, genuinely ruthless ruler operating within one of medieval Europe's most impossibly precarious political positions, making calculated, often horrifying decisions that reflected both the genuine constraints of his circumstances and his own particular psychological formation, shaped by childhood trauma, political betrayal, and a worldview in which absolute consistency, however brutal, seemed like the only reliable path to survival. The women of the court and the village so far, this story has moved largely through a world of princes, boyars, sultans, and soldiers, which is not surprising, since surviving medieval records overwhelmingly document the activities of men holding formal political and military power. But half of the population living through these events were women, and though their individual names rarely survive in the chronicles, we can reconstruct a reasonably clear picture of what their lives generally involved, both within Vlad's court and across the wider Wallachian countryside. At the level of the princely court, women occupied a position defined largely by marriage alliances and household management rather than direct political authority, though this should not be mistaken for a lack of influence entirely. Vlad's own mother, whose identity is not recorded with complete certainty in surviving sources, would have managed a household responsible for feeding, clothing, and organizing an entire princely establishment. A genuinely complex logistical undertaking involving the coordination of servants, the storage and distribution of food supplies, and the maintenance of the textiles and furnishings that marked a court's status. Noblewomen more broadly often served as crucial connective tissue between rival political families, their marriages arranged specifically to cement alliances between boyar factions or between Wallachia and its neighboring states, meaning a woman's personal fate was frequently determined entirely by the shifting political calculations of male relatives. Vlad's own marriage during his Hungarian captivity, discussed earlier, followed exactly this pattern, a union arranged to serve broader political integration rather than one built primarily on personal romantic choice, though this does not necessarily mean the relationship lacked genuine warmth or partnership, since arranged marriages throughout this period frequently developed into functional, even affectionate, working relationships over time. Beyond the princely court, in the ordinary villages that made up the vast majority of Wallachian society, women's daily lives centered on an extraordinarily demanding combination of agricultural labor, household production, and childcare, often performed simultaneously. A peasant woman's day typically began before dawn, tending livestock, drawing water, and preparing the first meal of the day, before moving into whatever combination of field labor, textile production, food preservation, or childcare the season demanded. Spinning wool and flax into thread, then weaving that thread into cloth, represented an almost constant background activity for most peasant women, since clothing an entire family required enormous amounts of labor that could not simply pause during busy agricultural seasons. Childbirth and infant mortality shaped women's lives in ways that are genuinely difficult for modern audiences to fully absorb emotionally. Without modern medical care, childbirth carried substantial risk for both mother and infant, and it was entirely common for women to bear multiple children across their reproductive years, with a meaningful percentage of those children not surviving infancy or early childhood. This was not experienced as an abstract statistic, as we might view it now, but as a recurring, deeply personal grief woven into the ordinary rhythm of village life, one that religious practice, particularly through the Orthodox Church's rich tradition of prayers and rituals surrounding both birth and death, helped communities process and endure. Marriage among ordinary peasants, unlike the politically calculated unions of the nobility, more often reflected practical considerations of labor, land, and family alliance within the local village community, though these marriages, too, were rarely matters of pure individual romantic choice by the standards we might recognize today. Village elders and family heads typically played a significant role in arranging appropriate matches, considering factors like a potential spouse's family reputation, land holdings, and capacity for productive labor. Despite these constraints, surviving folk traditions and later ethnographic studies of Romanian rural culture suggest that women within village communities often held considerable informal authority and respect, particularly older women who had survived multiple childbirths and accumulated decades of practical knowledge about herbal medicine, food preservation, and household management. Knowledge passed down through generations of mothers and daughters working side by side through countless repetitions of the same essential seasonal tasks. Market day. Let's slow the pace again for a moment and walk through an ordinary market day in Targoviste, because these gatherings offer one of the richest windows available into the actual sensory texture of daily life during Vlad's reign, a texture that political chronicles, focused almost entirely on princes and battles, rarely bother to preserve. Market day would have transformed the town's central square from its usual relatively quiet state into a dense, noisy convergence of sounds, smells, and activity. Farmers from surrounding villages would arrive before dawn, carts loaded with whatever the season offered: cabbages and onions in autumn, fresh greens and early vegetables in late spring, grain sacks throughout the harvest months. The creak of wooden cart wheels and the steady clop of horse or ox hooves against packed dirt would have provided a constant low rhythm beneath the sharper, louder calls of vendors announcing their goods. Livestock added their own considerable presence to this soundscape: chickens squawking from wicker cages, pigs squealing as they were herded toward buyers, the occasional lowing of cattle brought for sale or trade. Blacksmiths, tanners, and other craftsmen would have maintained their own stalls or nearby workshops, the rhythmic clang of hammer against metal occasionally cutting through the general market noise, while the sharp, distinctive smell of leather being cured drifted from the tanning quarter, typically kept at some distance from the main square due to its overwhelming odor. Food itself would have dominated much of the sensory experience. Fresh bread baked that morning released its warm, yeasty smell into the surrounding air, while nearby stalls might offer smoked or salted meats, their distinctive preserved smell mixing with the sharper scent of fresh herbs, garlic, and onions piled in wooden baskets. Wine and beer, both commonly consumed throughout this period, even by those who might today be considered underage, given that water quality could not always be trusted, would have been available from vendors serving both locals and travelers passing through on trade routes. Money itself, in the modern sense of standardized coinage universally accepted, existed in a considerably more complicated form than we might assume. Wallachia used a mixture of locally minted coins alongside foreign currency, particularly Hungarian and Ottoman coins, that circulated based on their actual precious metal content rather than any standardized face value, meaning market transactions frequently required a working knowledge of relative currency values, or simple direct barter of goods for goods, particularly in more rural areas with less regular access to formal currency. Language itself would have created a fascinating, layered soundscape on any given market day, since Wallachia's position at the intersection of multiple trading networks meant merchants speaking Romanian, German, Hungarian, and occasionally Turkish or Greek might all be conducting business within the same crowded square, their overlapping conversations forming a kind of practical, informal multilingualism that most ordinary Wallachians would have navigated through basic working phrases even without formal education in these languages. For a ruler like Vlad, deeply concerned with commerce, taxation, and the economic health of his fragile principality, market days represented far more than simple local color. They were the practical, visible manifestation of the trade policies he fought so hard to control, the tariffs he imposed on foreign merchants, the customs duties his officials collected, and the general economic vitality that funded everything else his reign required, from military campaigns to fortress construction to the elaborate diplomatic gifts expected in negotiations with more powerful neighboring courts. Strange customs and quiet superstitions, every society carries its own collection of beliefs and practices that later observers might find strange, and 15th-century Wallachia was no exception, blending formal Orthodox Christian doctrine with older folk traditions and superstitions that predated Christianity's arrival in the region by many centuries, existing alongside official religious practice in a comfortable, largely unremarked coexistence. Belief in various protective and harmful supernatural forces remained widespread throughout ordinary village life. Certain plants, particularly garlic, which would later become inseparably associated with vampire folklore through Stoker's novel and its countless adaptations, were genuinely believed throughout this broader region to hold protective properties against various forms of malevolent spirits or illness, a belief with roots extending back through centuries of folk medicine rather than any connection to the specific vampire mythology that would only develop and attach itself to this region much later. Funeral and burial customs, in particular, involved a rich collection of practices designed to ensure the deceased passed peacefully into the afterlife and did not linger to trouble the living. Certain precautions, including specific burial positions, protective items placed within graves, and particular rituals performed by family members, reflected genuine anxiety about the boundary between life and death, anxiety that existed across virtually every documented human culture, but which took on particular local flavors and specific practices unique to this Romanian and broader Eastern European folk tradition. Weather prediction and agricultural timing relied heavily on folk observation passed down through generations, often connected to specific religious feast days that had, over centuries, absorbed practical agricultural wisdom into their observance. Certain saints' days marked expected shifts in weather patterns or appropriate timing for specific agricultural tasks, creating a calendar that blended formal religious observance with genuinely useful practical knowledge accumulated through countless generations of careful seasonal observation. Humor, though far less documented in surviving sources than more serious matters of politics and religion, almost certainly played its own role in easing the genuine hardships of daily existence. Traveling storytellers and musicians, moving between villages and occasionally performing at wealthier courts, would have carried not only serious historical and religious narratives, but also comedic tales, riddles, and songs designed simply to entertain, providing rare moments of lightness within lives otherwise dominated by demanding physical labor and genuine uncertainty about matters like harvest success, disease, and political stability. Even Vlad himself, despite his overwhelming historical reputation for grim severity, appears in a handful of surviving anecdotes displaying what might charitably be called a very dark, very particular sense of humor, closely intertwined with his broader approach to punishment and intimidation. Several accounts describe him posing pointed, almost rhetorical questions to visitors or subjects before ordering their execution, a kind of grim theatrical flourish that suggests a man who understood, and perhaps even took some perverse satisfaction in, the psychological theater of power and fear he had built his entire reign around. Whether we find this particular quality disturbing, fascinating, or simply another small piece of evidence complicating our overall picture of who this man actually was, it serves as a useful reminder that historical figures, even those whose reputations have calcified into simple categories of hero or monster across the passing centuries, were genuinely complex individuals shaped by specific personal experiences, cultural contexts, and, in Vlad's particular case, an almost unimaginable accumulation of childhood trauma and political betrayal. Faith, monasteries, and the Orthodox world religion in 15th century Wallachia was not a separate category of life sitting alongside politics, economics, and daily routine. It was woven directly through all of them, shaping everything from the calendar that governed agricultural work to the language used in official court documents to the architectural style of the buildings that still, in some cases, stand today. The Orthodox Church that Vlad and his subjects belonged to traced its authority back to Constantinople, following the Byzantine liturgical and theological tradition rather than the Roman Catholic practice dominant in neighboring Hungary and much of Western Europe. This distinction carried real political weight throughout Vlad's life, since it meant Wallachia's spiritual orientation pointed toward an Eastern Christian world that was, during precisely this period, collapsing under Ottoman conquest, while its most immediate potential military allies against that same Ottoman threat followed a different Western Christian tradition, creating an additional layer of complexity in every diplomatic negotiation Vlad conducted throughout his various reigns. Monasteries functioned as the primary centers of literacy, learning, and record-keeping throughout Wallachian society, since formal education beyond basic practical skills remained almost entirely concentrated within religious institutions. Monks trained in reading and writing Church Slavonic, the liturgical and administrative language used throughout much of the Orthodox Slavic and Romanian world during this period, served as scribes, translators, and record keepers for both religious and secular purposes, meaning Vlad's own official correspondence and decrees would have passed through hands trained within this monastic educational tradition. Snagov Monastery, which we've already discussed extensively in connection with Vlad's disputed burial, exemplifies this broader pattern of monastic significance. Located on its small island, accessible only by boat, the monastery combined genuine religious devotion with practical defensive advantages, its isolated location offering protection from the kind of sudden military raids and political violence that plagued more exposed settlements throughout this turbulent period. Vlad's documented patronage of this specific monastery, including donations of land and resources during his reigns, suggests genuine personal religious investment beyond mere political calculation, though, as with so much about this man, we cannot know with certainty exactly how his private faith related to his public brutality. Daily religious practice for ordinary Wallachians involved a rhythm of prayer, fasting, and feast day observance that structured time far more thoroughly than any secular calendar could have managed independently. The Orthodox liturgical calendar included extended fasting periods, particularly the lengthy fast preceding Easter, during which meat, dairy, and sometimes fish were entirely avoided, a practice that, combined with the general seasonal scarcity of late winter and early spring, meant this particular fasting period often coincided with genuine, unavoidable food scarcity anyway. blending religious discipline with practical necessity in ways that likely felt less like separate categories of experience than modern observers might assume. Icons, the distinctive religious paintings central to Orthodox worship, would have been present in churches throughout Wallachia. Their stylized, deliberately non-naturalistic imagery serving not as simple decoration, but as genuine objects of religious veneration, believed by worshippers to provide a direct spiritual connection to the sacred figures they depicted. Even relatively humble village churches would have contained at least a modest collection of these icons, their surfaces darkened over time by decades of candle smoke and the touch of countless worshippers' hands and lips during prayer. Death and burial practices, as touched on in our earlier discussion of folk superstition, blended formal Orthodox liturgical practice with older regional traditions in ways the Church generally tolerated, as long as they did not directly contradict core theological doctrine. Funeral services followed established Orthodox liturgical patterns, but surrounding customs, including specific timing of memorial observances at set intervals after death, and particular practices surrounding the preparation of the body, reflected a genuinely rich folk tradition existing in comfortable, largely unexamined coexistence alongside official church teaching. For Vlad himself, a man whose life included both formal Orthodox upbringing and a later politically motivated conversion to Catholicism during his Hungarian captivity, religious identity clearly carried genuine political weight, even if we cannot fully access his private spiritual convictions. His eventual Catholic conversion, discussed earlier, represents one more example of how thoroughly political necessity shaped even the most personal dimensions of his life, a pattern that had already defined his childhood Ottoman captivity, his early political alliances, and would continue shaping his choices right up through his final, brief restoration to power. Arges Rivers, and the movement of news in a world without printing presses reaching ordinary villages, without any postal system in the modern sense, and without any technology faster than a horse or a river current, the simple physical movement of information across Wallachia's landscape shaped political and economic life in ways that are easy to overlook from our own vantage point of instant global communication. Wallachia's road network, such as it was, consisted primarily of dirt tracks connecting major towns and following the natural contours of the landscape, becoming genuinely treacherous during spring thaws and heavy autumn rains, when accumulated water could transform these packed earth roads into thick, nearly impassable mud. Rivers, particularly the Danube forming Wallachia's southern border, and various tributaries flowing down from the Carpathian Mountains, functioned as the true highways of this landscape, allowing considerably faster and more reliable transport of both goods and information than overland travel could typically manage. Official communication, whether diplomatic correspondence, royal decrees, or military orders, traveled via mounted messengers capable of covering considerably more ground per day than merchant caravans burdened with heavy goods, though even these dedicated messengers remained entirely dependent on weather conditions, road quality, and the physical endurance of both horse and rider. A message traveling from Vlad's court in Targoviste to Hungarian authorities in Buda or to Ottoman authorities across the Danube would have taken days at minimum, and considerably longer during winter months or periods of heavy rain, meaning political decisions frequently had to be made based on information that was already, by the time it arrived, several days or even weeks out of date. This communication delay had genuine, practical consequences for exactly the kind of high-stakes political maneuvering that defined Vlad's entire career. Military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and even basic administrative coordination across Wallachia's territory all operated under this fundamental constraint, meaning rulers like Vlad needed to make consequential decisions based on incomplete, often outdated information, while simultaneously trying to anticipate how their own orders and correspondence might be received, interpreted, or intercepted by hostile parties days or weeks after being sent. Trade routes, meanwhile, connected Wallachia to a surprisingly broad commercial network, extending well beyond its immediate neighbors. Goods moved along established paths connecting the Transylvanian Saxon towns we've discussed extensively, through Wallachia itself, and onward toward Ottoman territory and the broader Mediterranean trading world, carrying everything from the salt that formed one of Wallachia's most valuable domestic resources to spices, textiles, and manufactured goods, arriving from considerably more distant origins. Word of mouth carried by these same merchants, travelers, and messengers moving along established roads and rivers remained the primary mechanism through which most ordinary Wallachians learned about events beyond their immediate village, meaning news of Vlad's various military campaigns, political struggles, and eventual death would have reached different communities at dramatically different speeds. With more remote villages potentially remaining unaware of significant political developments for weeks or even months after they occurred in the capital. This fundamental slowness of information also helps explain, at least partially, how the various competing narratives about Vlad, the horrified German pamphlets, the more admiring Russian chronicles, and whatever more nuanced or ambivalent folk memories existed among his own Wallachian subjects, could develop and circulate largely independently of one another for so long, each reaching different audiences through entirely separate communication networks, without any single unified, contemporaneous account ever emerging to definitively settle how this genuinely complicated ruler should be remembered. White gold we mentioned briefly, much earlier in this story. That salt functioned as one of Wallachia's most valuable economic resources, and this deserves a closer look, because understanding the salt trade helps explain how a relatively small, politically vulnerable principality managed to fund the kind of military campaigns, fortress construction, and diplomatic maneuvering that defined Vlad's entire career. Wallachia sat atop substantial natural salt deposits, particularly in the region around modern Akhnel Mari, where salt had been mined continuously since ancient times, long before the medieval Principality of Wallachia even existed as a political entity. In a world without refrigeration, salt represented an absolutely essential resource, not a luxury seasoning as it might seem today, but a critical tool for preserving meat, fish, and other perishable foods through the long winter months when fresh food became scarce or entirely unavailable. This made salt an enormously valuable trade commodity, one that Wallachian rulers, including Vlad himself, could tax and control to generate significant crown revenue independent of the more contested and complicated tariffs on foreign merchant trade that caused so much friction with the Transylvanian Saxon towns. Salt mining itself involved genuinely grueling physical labor, workers descending into mine shafts to extract salt through methods that had changed relatively little across centuries, using basic tools to break salt from the surrounding rock before hauling it to the surface for transport and sale. The revenue generated through salt taxation and trade provided Wallachian princes with a crucial degree of financial independence that helps explain how a country with relatively modest overall wealth compared to its larger neighbors could still fund the kind of sustained military resistance Vlad mounted against Ottoman forces in 1462. Without this reliable domestic revenue source, Vlad's entire anti-Ottoman campaign, requiring the maintenance of soldiers, weapons, and fortifications like the reconstructed stronghold above the Arges River, would have been considerably more difficult to sustain even for the relatively brief period it actually lasted. Beyond its purely economic significance, the salt trade also connected Wallachia to broader regional and even international commercial networks, since salt produced in Wallachian mines traveled along established trade routes reaching neighboring Transylvania, Moldavia, and beyond, creating ongoing commercial relationships that existed independently of, and sometimes in direct tension with, the political and military conflicts that dominate most historical accounts of this period. Merchants involved in this salt trade needed reasonably stable, predictable conditions to conduct business successfully, meaning even a ruler as generally disruptive to established trade patterns, as Vlad had genuine practical incentives to maintain at least some functional commercial relationships, alongside his more confrontational political and military policies. This economic dimension of Vlad's reign rarely receives the same attention as his military campaigns or his brutal methods of maintaining domestic order, but it represents an equally essential piece of understanding how he actually managed to govern, however briefly and however precariously, a principality caught in such an impossibly difficult geopolitical position. Behind every impaled boyar and every reconstructed fortress wall lay the quieter, less dramatic reality of tax collection, resource management, and the ongoing economic administration required to keep any medieval state functioning at all. A national symbol, centuries later it's worth pausing to consider how Vlad's reputation has evolved within Romania itself, since this internal national perspective offers a genuinely different picture than either the horrified Western European Gothic tradition or the more academic historical debates we've spent considerable time exploring tonight. Within Romanian national memory, particularly from the 19th century onward, as Romanian nationalism developed alongside broader European nationalist movements, Vlad has been embraced, somewhat surprisingly to outside observers familiar primarily with his vampire associations, as a genuine national hero. This reframing emphasizes precisely the qualities that Western Gothic fiction and hostile German pamphlets treated as evidence of monstrous cruelty, reinterpreting them instead as evidence of decisive, uncompromising leadership during an existential struggle against foreign, specifically Ottoman, domination. This national reframing draws heavily on exactly the themes we discussed earlier in connection with the Russian chronicles. Vlad's harsh justice as evidence of effective governance rather than senseless brutality, his military resistance against overwhelming Ottoman forces as evidence of genuine courage and tactical brilliance rather than simple, doomed defiance. Romanian historical education and popular culture have generally presented Vlad, particularly throughout the 20th century, as a defender of Wallachian sovereignty and Christian European civilization against Ottoman expansion, a figure whose harsh methods, while acknowledged, are contextualized as necessary responses to genuinely desperate circumstances rather than as the primary defining feature of his historical legacy. This creates a genuinely fascinating cultural situation where the same historical figure occupies almost entirely opposite positions in different cultural imaginations simultaneously. To much of the world familiar primarily with Stoker's novel and its countless film adaptations, the name Dracula evokes supernatural horror with only vague, often confused awareness of any connection to actual Romanian history. Within Romania itself, Vlad occupies a position closer to how Americans might think of certain harsh but effective founding historical figures, a complicated, sometimes uncomfortable, but generally respected symbol of national resistance and sovereignty during one of the most existentially threatening periods in the country's early history. Romanian tourism has learned to navigate this strange duality with considerable practical skill, offering visitors both the Gothic vampire experience many international tourists specifically seek out, centered around Bran Castle despite its tenuous actual historical connection to Vlad, and a more historically grounded experience for visitors specifically interested in the documented reality of his life and reign, centered around sites like Ponari Castle, Targoviste, and Snagov Monastery that carry genuine, verified historical connections to his actual documented activities. This tension between historical memory and Gothic myth is not unique to Vlad, of course. Many historical figures across many cultures have been simplified, exaggerated, or reframed by later generations to serve contemporary political, cultural, or commercial purposes far removed from the actual historical circumstances of their original lives. But few historical figures illustrate this broader pattern quite as dramatically or as completely as Vlad, whose actual documented life, however brutal and however genuinely disturbing in certain specific episodes, bears remarkably little resemblance to either the supernatural monster of Western Gothic fiction or the uncomplicated national hero of some more simplified patriotic narratives, existing instead in the considerably more complicated, more genuinely human space we've spent this entire evening trying carefully to reconstruct. The turning year lets slow down once more, because it's important, in a story this dense with politics and violence, to keep returning to the simpler, quieter rhythms that actually structured most people's lived experience throughout this period, regardless of who happened to be sitting on the Wallachian throne at any given moment. Spring in Wallachia arrived gradually, often unevenly, with the lowland plains along the Danube warming considerably faster than the higher elevations near the Carpathian foothills, where snow might linger well into what calendars called spring. The thaw brought both relief and genuine danger, as melting snow swelled rivers and streams, occasionally flooding low-lying fields and villages, while simultaneously softening the frozen ground enough to finally permit the plowing and planting that the entire year's food supply depended upon. The first green shoots pushing through thawed soil would have carried genuine emotional weight for communities that had spent months surviving on carefully rationed stored food, a visible, tangible sign that the hardest part of the year was finally, gradually loosening its grip. Summer brought long working days stretched to their absolute physical limits, as the short growing season available in this climate required intense, sustained agricultural labor to properly prepare, tend, and eventually harvest crops before autumn's shorter days and eventual frost returned. Heat during peak summer months could become genuinely oppressive, particularly in the lowland plains, while sudden violent thunderstorms, common throughout this continental climate zone, could arrive with remarkably little warning, threatening standing crops with hail or flooding, even as they provided desperately needed moisture during drier stretches. Autumn represented perhaps the most intensely active season of the entire year, a race against the calendar to harvest grain, gather and preserve vegetables, slaughter and process livestock, and generally prepare every possible resource for the long winter ahead. The distinctive smell of this season, wood smoke from countless small fires used in various food preservation processes, mixed with the earthier scent of freshly turned soil, and the sweet, slightly fermented smell of fruit being processed into preserves or early stages of alcohol production, would have marked this period as distinctly, unmistakably different from any other point in the yearly cycle. Winter, as we've already discussed at some length, transformed the entire landscape into something quieter, harsher, and considerably more dangerous, testing every preparation made during the busier preceding seasons. Snow could isolate villages for extended periods, cutting off regular travel and communication with neighboring settlements, while cold temperatures placed genuine, sometimes fatal stress on the elderly, the very young, and anyone weakened by illness or malnutrition heading into the season's hardest months. This annual cycle, repeating with remarkable consistency across generation after generation, provided a kind of stable, predictable rhythm that stood in stark contrast to the genuinely chaotic, unpredictable political violence that periodically disrupted Wallachian society throughout Vlad's lifetime and well beyond it. Armies might march through, princes might rise and fall, boyars might conspire and be executed, but the wheat still needed planting each spring, the harvest still needed gathering each autumn, and the long winter still needed surviving each year, regardless of who currently claimed the right to rule over the people performing this endless, essential labor. It's worth remembering this deeper rhythm as we move toward the final chapters of tonight's story, because it offers a useful counterweight to the intensely dramatic, often violent political narrative that has necessarily dominated most of what we've discussed. Beneath every battle and every execution, this quieter, more enduring cycle of planting, growing, harvesting, and surviving continued largely undisturbed, carried forward by countless anonymous families whose names never appeared in any chronicle, but whose steady, patient labor made possible everything else this story has described. The weight of a childhood before we bring this story to its close. It's worth gathering together something we've touched on repeatedly throughout tonight's telling, but which deserves one final, focused moment of reflection. The question of how Vlad's childhood experiences shaped the ruler and the man he eventually became. Consider the specific sequence of events this one boy actually lived through before reaching full adulthood. Born into a family whose political position was precarious from the very beginning, he was sent away from his home at around 11 years old to live among the very empire his country feared most, a hostage whose safety depended entirely on his father's continued political compliance. During these formative adolescent years, away from his parents and his homeland, he watched his younger brother apparently adapt comfortably to this foreign court, while he himself, by most historical accounts, absorbed the experience as a form of prolonged humiliation and hidden resentment. Then, while still a teenager and still living under this same Ottoman supervision, he received word that his father had been murdered by a coalition of Hungarian military force and his own country's rebellious nobility, and that his older brother had been tortured to death through blinding and live burial by these same domestic political enemies. Within a remarkably short span, this adolescent boy lost his father, his brother, his homeland's stability, and any reasonable sense that the adults responsible for his safety, whether Ottoman captors or Wallachian countrymen, could be trusted to act in his genuine interest. He then briefly claimed his father's throne through Ottoman backing, only to lose it almost immediately to the same Hungarian commander responsible for his father's death, forcing him into years of uncertain exile before he could even attempt to reclaim what he considered rightfully his. When he finally did reclaim the Wallachian throne permanently in 1456, he did so as a young man not yet even 30 years old, ruling over a nobility that included, quite possibly, individuals directly involved in his own father's murder years earlier. Given this sequence of experiences, the psychological pattern historians consistently identify across Vlad's actual reign, an almost obsessive commitment to absolute consistency, harsh punishment for any perceived disloyalty, and a general worldview in which trust appears to have been an extraordinarily scarce, carefully rationed resource, becomes considerably easier to understand. Even if understanding it does not require excusing the genuine horror of many specific actions this psychological pattern produced. This is not to suggest some simple, deterministic explanation in which childhood trauma mechanically produces adult cruelty, a framework far too simplistic for the genuine complexity of human psychology, and far too simplistic for the specific historical circumstances Vlad actually navigated. Many individuals experience severe childhood trauma without becoming rulers who impale thousands of people. But understanding the specific, documented sequence of betrayals, losses, and forced displacements that shaped Vlad's adolescence does offer genuine historical insight into why a man raised under these exact circumstances might have concluded, rightly or wrongly, that survival in his particular political world required exactly the kind of absolute, terrifying consistency he eventually built his entire reputation upon. This more psychologically grounded understanding does not transform Vlad into a purely sympathetic figure, nor should it. The people who suffered under his methods of rule, whether boyars executed for suspected disloyalty, merchants raided for economic defiance, or, in the darkest documented episodes, ordinary beggars killed simply for representing visible poverty within his kingdom, experienced genuine, unjustifiable horror regardless of whatever childhood trauma might help explain Vlad's own psychological formation. But holding both of these truths simultaneously, genuine documented cruelty alongside a genuinely difficult, traumatic childhood shaped by forces largely beyond his own control, offers a more historically honest, more genuinely complicated portrait than either the purely monstrous or purely heroic simplified versions that have dominated his popular legacy for so many centuries. What became of his children? Vlad's death in late 1476 or early 1477 did not end his family line, though the subsequent fates of his children reveal, once again, just how thoroughly political circumstance rather than personal merit continued determining outcomes for this family across generations. From his marriage during Hungarian captivity, discussed earlier, Vlad had at least 2 sons who survived into adulthood. One of these sons, generally identified in historical records as Mihnia, would eventually claim the Wallachian throne himself decades later, ruling briefly in the early 16th century under the notably grim nickname Mihnia the Bad. A nickname suggesting his own reign may have echoed some of his father's harsher governing tendencies, though considerably less documentation survives regarding the specific details of his actual policies compared to his more famous father. Beyond this documented son, historical records regarding Vlad's other children grow considerably murkier, complicated further by the genuine uncertainty surrounding his earlier marriages and relationships prior to his Hungarian captivity, about which surviving sources provide frustratingly incomplete information. Some historical traditions suggest Vlad may have had a daughter from an earlier relationship who eventually relocated to Italy, potentially connecting to the Naples burial theory we discussed earlier in connection with his disputed final resting place. Though, as noted then, this connection remains speculative rather than conclusively established through verified historical or genetic evidence. What we can say with greater confidence is that Vlad's direct male line, through his son Mihnia and Mihnia's own descendants, continued for at least several additional generations within Wallachian and broader regional nobility, though none of these descendants achieved anything close to the historical significance or infamy that would eventually attach itself so permanently to Vlad's own name. This is, in its own way, a genuinely common pattern across medieval history more broadly. Dramatic, historically significant figures frequently produce descendants who live out considerably quieter, less consequential lives, their family's most famous chapter having already been written by an earlier generation whose exceptional circumstances, whether exceptional achievement or exceptional trauma, are rarely replicated by those who follow. There is something genuinely poignant, when you sit with it for a moment, in recognizing that the actual biological descendants of this man whose name would eventually become one of the most recognized in global popular culture, lived out lives of relative historical obscurity, their existence documented only in scattered fragments of surviving records, while their ancestors' name entirely divorced from any of these actual descendants. Transformed into a globally recognized symbol of Gothic horror that has generated countless novels, films, and cultural products bearing only the thinnest connection to the actual historical family whose name was borrowed to create it. Returning to the island, we opened this story on a small island, surrounded by still, dark water, watching a monk cross a frozen courtyard toward a plain stone slab bearing no name. Let's return there now, one final time, before we close this evening's story, because that quiet, unremarkable scene contains, when you understand everything we've discussed tonight, an almost unbearable weight of unresolved historical meaning. That stone slab, whether or not it ever actually marked Vlad's genuine burial location, represents something larger than a simple grave marker. It represents the fundamental uncertainty that surrounds nearly everything about this man's life and death, an uncertainty that historians, despite genuinely dedicated scholarly effort across many decades, have never fully managed to resolve. We know with reasonable historical confidence the broad outline of his life: the Ottoman hostage-taking, the murdered father and brother, the brutal consolidation of power, the war against Mehmed II, the Hungarian imprisonment, the brief final restoration, and the mysterious death that ended it all. But so many of the specific details that would allow us to fully understand this man, his precise motivations, his genuine emotional experience of the traumas he endured, even the actual final location of his physical remains, exist permanently just beyond our historical reach. This uncertainty is not a failure of historical research. It is, in a strange way, an honest reflection of how genuinely difficult it is to reconstruct the full, textured reality of any human life from 5.5 centuries in the past, particularly a life lived by someone who existed at the volatile intersection of multiple competing political and religious worlds, each with their own reasons to remember him selectively, whether through horrified German pamphlets, admiring Russian chronicles, or the later Gothic literary tradition that would eventually transform his name into something almost entirely divorced from his actual documented history. Standing, in our imagination, beside that same quiet stone slab on Snagov's small island, surrounded by the same still water and dense surrounding forest that has changed remarkably little since Vlad's own lifetime, it becomes possible to hold both halves of this story simultaneously. Here lies, or perhaps does not lie, a man capable of genuinely horrifying cruelty, a ruler who used mass execution and calculated terror as deliberate instruments of governance, whose documented actions against boyars, merchants, and reportedly even his own kingdom's poor, represent genuine historical atrocities that deserve neither excuse nor minimization. And here also, simultaneously, lies, or perhaps does not lie, a deeply traumatized child who lost his father and brother to political violence before he had even reached full adulthood, a young ruler who inherited an almost impossibly precarious political position squeezed between two hostile empires, a military commander who achieved genuinely remarkable tactical success against overwhelming odds, and a man whose final years ended in obscure, quickly forgotten battle rather than any grand, dramatic confrontation befitting the mythological status his name would eventually acquire. Both of these portraits are true. Neither one, standing alone, captures the full genuine complexity of who Vlad Dracula actually was. The face beneath the legend, one question people frequently ask when encountering Vlad's actual documented history for the first time, after learning how much of the popular vampire mythology bears no genuine connection to his real life, is a surprisingly simple one. What did he actually look like? The most commonly reproduced image associated with Vlad is a portrait, painted well after his death, showing a man with strikingly long, dark, wavy hair, a prominent hooked nose, intense, wide-set eyes, and a distinctive mustache, dressed in the kind of elaborate, fur-trimmed clothing befitting a nobleman of considerable status. This portrait, along with several closely related versions housed in various European collections, is generally believed by art historians to derive ultimately from an original image, possibly created during his lifetime or shortly afterward, though the surviving copies we actually have today were produced decades later, meaning we cannot be entirely certain how closely they preserve his genuine, documented appearance. What we can say with somewhat greater confidence is that these portraits emerged from the same broader artistic and documentary tradition that also produced the hostile German pamphlets we've discussed at length, meaning even Vlad's visual legacy carries the same fundamental uncertainty, affecting nearly every other aspect of his historical record. The intense, somewhat unsettling expression captured in these portraits, an expression that later popular culture would eventually amplify considerably in service of an increasingly Gothic, supernatural visual tradition, may reflect genuine physical features, deliberate artistic choices meant to convey his documented reputation for severity, or some combination of both influences working together. Physical descriptions found within surviving written chronicles offer additional, if still frustratingly incomplete, details. Several accounts describe him as being of relatively short but powerfully built stature, with the kind of physical presence expected of a ruler who personally led military campaigns and reportedly participated directly in combat rather than simply directing operations from a safe distance. Beyond these general impressions, the specific, detailed physical description that might allow us to truly picture this man with genuine historical confidence simply does not survive in sufficient documented detail. Modern forensic and historical reconstruction efforts, drawing on the surviving portraits alongside general knowledge of 15th-century Wallachian nobility, have produced various artistic interpretations attempting to bridge this gap between limited historical evidence and popular curiosity. These reconstructions should be understood, however, as reasonable scholarly speculation rather than definitively accurate representations, since no confirmed physical remains have ever been conclusively identified and studied using the kind of forensic techniques that have helped researchers reconstruct the appearance of other historical figures whose remains have been more definitively located and verified. This uncertainty extends even to something as seemingly basic as what this man actually looked like, one more small but genuinely telling example of how thoroughly legend has obscured even the most fundamental documented facts about his actual historical existence, leaving us to reconstruct our mental image of him from a combination of contested portraits, brief written descriptions, and inevitably, our own accumulated cultural associations with a name that has come to mean something entirely different in popular imagination than it ever meant during his own actual lifetime. Separating the man from the monster, one last time as we approach the final chapters of tonight's story, it's worth directly addressing, one final time and as clearly as possible, the specific supernatural elements that popular culture has permanently attached to Vlad's name, elements that deserve explicit clarification precisely because they have become so thoroughly, inseparably associated with him despite having absolutely no basis whatsoever in any documented historical evidence. There is no historical evidence, from any source, hostile or favorable, contemporary or later, suggesting that Vlad drank blood, possessed any supernatural abilities, feared sunlight or religious symbols in any way beyond ordinary human religious devotion, or continued any form of existence beyond his well-documented death in battle sometime in late 1476 or early 1477. These specific vampire mythology elements originate entirely from Bram Stoker's 1897 novel and its subsequent countless adaptations, drawing on broader European vampire folklore traditions that existed independently of Vlad's specific historical existence, connected to him only through Stoker's decision to borrow his family name for an entirely fictional supernatural character. The broader vampire folklore tradition that Stoker actually drew upon most heavily originated primarily from Slavic and broader Eastern European folk beliefs about revenants, restless dead who supposedly returned from their graves to trouble the living, beliefs that predate Vlad's own lifetime by many centuries and existed across a considerably broader geographic region than Wallachia alone. These folk beliefs about vampiric revenants were genuinely, actively held by many ordinary people across various Eastern European cultures during the medieval and early modern periods, reflecting real anxieties about death, disease, and the boundary between life and the afterlife that we touched on earlier in our discussion of Wallachian folk superstition. But these beliefs developed and existed entirely independently of Vlad's specific historical reign and reputation. What Stoker actually did in choosing to name his fictional vampire character after this specific historical figure was essentially borrow a genuinely evocative, exotic-sounding name carrying vague associations with historical cruelty, and attach it to an entirely separate literary and folkloric tradition that had developed independently over previous centuries. This combination proved so culturally powerful and so commercially successful across subsequent adaptations that it has now become genuinely difficult, for many people encountering this history for the first time, to fully separate the borrowed name from the entirely fictional supernatural tradition it eventually became inseparably associated with. Understanding this distinction clearly does not mean dismissing Vlad's genuine historical brutality as somehow less significant or less worthy of serious historical attention. The documented atrocities, the mass executions, the calculated psychological terror, the harsh treatment of his own kingdom's most vulnerable populations represent genuine historical horror that deserves serious, honest examination on its own terms, entirely separate from any supernatural embellishment. If anything, understanding Vlad as a genuinely human ruler, operating within genuinely human political and psychological constraints, makes his documented actions considerably more historically significant and considerably more worth understanding than if we simply dismissed him as some kind of supernatural, inhuman monster whose motivations exist beyond ordinary human comprehension entirely. The real Vlad, stripped of centuries of Gothic embellishment and vampire mythology, remains a genuinely compelling historical figure precisely because he was entirely, undeniably human, shaped by documented childhood trauma, genuine political constraints, and specific psychological patterns that historians can trace with reasonable confidence through the surviving historical record. That human complexity, rather than any supernatural mythology, is ultimately what makes his actual documented story worth the considerable time we've spent exploring it together tonight. The view from the other side throughout tonight's story, we've spent considerable time inside Vlad's own perspective and inside the experience of his Wallachian subjects, but it's worth pausing before we close to consider how this entire conflict might have looked from across the Danube through Ottoman eyes, because history rarely makes complete sense when told from only one side of any given conflict. Sultan Mehmed II, the man whose massive invasion force Vlad so successfully humiliated in 1462, was, by any reasonable historical assessment, one of the most capable and consequential rulers of his entire era, a commander who had already accomplished the conquest of Constantinople, ending a Byzantine imperial tradition stretching back over 1,000 years, before turning his attention north toward Wallachia. From his perspective, and from the perspective of the broader Ottoman administrative and military establishment he commanded, Wallachia represented a relatively minor, if genuinely irritating, obstacle within a much larger imperial project of continued expansion across the Balkans and beyond. Ottoman soldiers marching north into Wallachia during that fateful 1462 campaign would have experienced this conflict very differently than the dramatic, decisive confrontation later chronicles sometimes suggest. For most ordinary soldiers within this massive invading force, the campaign likely felt less like an epic clash between civilizations and more like an increasingly miserable slog through hostile, deliberately emptied territory, plagued by disease, uncertain supply lines, and the constant, unnerving possibility of ambush from an enemy who refused to meet them in the kind of open battle their numerical superiority would have easily won. The psychological impact of encountering fields of impaled bodies, discussed earlier from Vlad's strategic perspective as a calculated act of psychological warfare, would have registered very differently among the actual soldiers who encountered this scene firsthand, men far from home, already exhausted and increasingly anxious, confronting visible, undeniable evidence of the fate that awaited anyone captured by this particular enemy. Whatever we might think today about the ethics of this tactic, its immediate practical effectiveness in demoralizing Ottoman troops seems entirely plausible given ordinary human psychology, regardless of how significantly later chroniclers may have exaggerated the specific scale of what these soldiers actually witnessed. From the broader Ottoman administrative perspective, meanwhile, Wallachia's persistent instability, cycling repeatedly between rulers willing to accept Ottoman vassal status and rulers like Vlad determined to resist it, represented an ongoing, frustrating drain on resources and attention that could otherwise be directed toward more strategically significant Ottoman priorities elsewhere across an empire stretching across 3 continents. This helps explain why, following Vlad's initial military resistance, the Ottoman response ultimately favored supporting his more cooperative brother Radu's alternative claim to the throne, rather than committing to the kind of sustained, costly military campaign that might have been required to permanently eliminate Wallachian resistance entirely. Political and military pragmatism, weighing costs against strategic benefits, shaped Ottoman decision-making just as thoroughly as it shaped Vlad's own choices throughout this entire conflict. This broader perspective helps us understand something important about how relatively minor this entire dramatic confrontation, so central to Vlad's eventual legend, actually appeared within the much larger context of Ottoman imperial strategy during this period. Vlad's successful resistance genuinely embarrassed Ottoman forces and genuinely demonstrated the practical limits of even overwhelming numerical superiority when confronted with determined, creative guerrilla resistance on unfavorable terrain. But from Constantinople's perspective, Wallachia remained, ultimately, a peripheral concern within a far larger imperial project, one that would continue its broader expansion across the Balkans and beyond for centuries after Vlad's own death, largely indifferent to whichever particular prince happened to be sitting on Wallachia's own relatively minor regional throne at any given historical moment. The castle that outlasted the man. Before we close this long evening together, let's take one final walk back up the steep mountain path toward the fortress Vlad actually built with his own forced laborers, because that place, more than any other single location connected to his story, seems to capture something essential about the gap between the man and the myth he eventually became. If you were to climb those roughly 1,500 steps today, arriving breathless at the ruined walls perched high above the Arges River gorge, you would find remarkably little remaining of the original structure. Time, earthquakes, and a documented landslide have claimed most of what Vlad's forced laborers actually built, leaving behind fragments of wall, foundation outlines barely visible beneath encroaching vegetation, and a genuinely spectacular view over forested mountains that has likely changed only modestly since the 15th century. Compare this to Bran Castle, the far more visited, far more architecturally impressive fortress, whose actual historical connection to Vlad remains tenuous at best, resting on possibly brief, poorly documented visits rather than any sustained residence, ownership, or construction. Bran Castle draws considerably larger crowds, its picturesque towers and dramatic mountain setting having become inseparably linked in global popular imagination with the fictional vampire count who borrowed Vlad's family name but almost none of his actual documented history. This disparity, a ruined fortress genuinely connected to Vlad's real life, receiving far less attention than a more photogenic castle connected primarily to a fictional character loosely inspired by his name, captures something genuinely important about how historical memory actually functions across centuries. The version of history that survives most vividly in popular imagination is rarely the most historically accurate version. It is instead the version that proves most emotionally compelling, most visually striking, or most useful to whatever cultural or commercial purposes later generations happen to need it for. None of this diminishes what actually happened on that mountain ridge above the Arges River, however. Real forced laborers, boyars and their families, according to persistent historical tradition, genuinely climbed that difficult terrain carrying stone and mortar under a prince's direct order, genuinely suffered through the harsh physical conditions this labor demanded, and genuinely built something that provided Vlad with the secure defensive retreat he clearly believed his precarious political position required. That genuine human labor and suffering deserves to be remembered on its own historical terms, regardless of how much less commercially appealing this location has proven compared to its more famous, more fictional counterpart. We began tonight beside a quiet monastery on a small island, watching a monk cross a frozen courtyard toward an unmarked grave that may or may not have ever actually held the man we've spent this entire evening trying to understand. Let's return there one final time, as the night grows later and this long story finally draws toward its close. That monk, going about his ordinary daily routine centuries ago, had no way of knowing that the empty ground he swept clean of snow each winter would eventually become the subject of archaeological investigation, scholarly debate, and endless popular speculation stretching across more than 5 centuries. He was simply performing the quiet, repetitive tasks that monastery life required, tending a sacred space whose significance, in his own daily experience, had far more to do with prayer and religious devotion than with the political history of any particular ruler who happened to be buried or not buried nearby. There is something genuinely worth sitting with in that quiet obliviousness, that simple, unremarkable daily continuity existing alongside, yet almost entirely separate from, the dramatic historical events we've spent tonight exploring in such detail. While Vlad fought wars, executed boyars, terrified Ottoman armies, and eventually died in circumstances history still cannot fully clarify, countless ordinary people, farmers, monks, merchants, mothers raising children through impossibly difficult infant mortality rates, continued the essential, repetitive work of simply surviving, largely indifferent to which particular prince currently claimed authority over their distant, largely theoretical political loyalty. This is, in many ways, the deepest truth this entire story has tried to illuminate. History, as it actually happened, rarely resembles the clean, simplified narratives that later generations construct from its scattered remains. Vlad Dracula was neither a supernatural monster nor a straightforward hero. He was a genuinely traumatized child who became a genuinely ruthless ruler, operating within genuinely impossible political circumstances, making calculated decisions that produced genuine horror alongside genuine, if brief, political and military success. His actual life, examined honestly through the fragmentary, often contradictory sources that happen to survive, offers something considerably more historically interesting and considerably more genuinely human than either the Gothic vampire his name eventually came to represent, or the uncomplicated national hero some more simplified patriotic narratives sometimes prefer. Perhaps this is the most valuable thing history can offer us, when we approach it carefully and honestly rather than reaching immediately for comfortable, simplified categories. Not a clean moral lesson, not a simple hero or villain to admire or condemn without complication, but a genuine, textured understanding of how impossibly difficult circumstances, combined with individual human psychology shaped by specific documented trauma, can produce outcomes that resist easy categorization entirely. Vlad's own bones, wherever they may actually rest today, whether beneath that quiet stone slab at Snagov, in some other grave within that same monastery complex, in a distant Italian chapel connected to his displaced daughter, or lost entirely to 5.5 centuries of political upheaval and simple historical accident, continue resisting the kind of tidy resolution that popular culture generally prefers for its most famous historical figures. Perhaps that lingering, unresolved mystery is fitting for a man whose entire documented life resists exactly the kind of simple, comfortable categorization we generally prefer when telling stories about the past. As we close tonight's story, picture once more that frozen courtyard, that small island surrounded by still, dark water, that ordinary monk going about his quiet daily routine centuries ago, entirely unaware that he was walking each morning across ground that would eventually become the subject of such extensive historical fascination and genuine scholarly mystery. The snow falls just as quietly there tonight as it did then. The lake remains just as still. And somewhere within that quiet, ongoing continuity, largely indifferent to the dramatic human history that once unfolded around it, this story finally comes to its rest. Thank you for spending this long evening with me, walking through the genuinely complicated life of a man whose name the world remembers, but whose actual history so few people ever take the time to properly understand. I hope tonight's journey through Wallachia's forests, its frozen winters, its market days, its monasteries, and its endlessly contested throne has given you something more valuable than simple horror or simple admiration, a genuinely textured, genuinely human understanding of just how complicated real history actually is beneath the simplified stories we tell about it. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it happens to be where you're listening, I hope you're feeling calm and settled and ready for a genuinely restful night's sleep. Thank you so much for staying with this story all the way to its quiet end. Sleep well, and I'll see you again next time for another long, slow walk through history.